Welcome everyone to our meeting of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. This is as a reminder, a meeting that is being broadcast and recorded as well. And so this is a part of the process that we use in discussing standard setting issues in a transparent manner. So we're going to be talking today about what we have learned as part of the work that we've been doing since the launch of our standards back in November. Just quickly, a few items of business. There'll be 2 open sessions as part of the current standards board meeting for today and then also tomorrow as well. And we have here in person members of our board. So that's Dan Gelter, Elizabeth Seeger, myself, Jeffrey Hales, Kurt Kuhn, Lloyd Kurtz, Mark Siegel, Bob Hurst, and Verity Shagar. And then we also have dialing in for this one, Stephanie Tang. Stephanie, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, wonderful, great, so we can hear you as well. For those who are going to be listening in as well, we welcome your observations and comments. As is typical, our open sessions are really an opportunity for you to hear the discussions that are going on at the Standards Board. And so, although they are not interactive sessions, we would welcome comments. And so if you have thoughts or questions from today, you can certainly email those to us by going to SASB's website and looking for the comment box. So we're going to be talking today about what we've learned from a number of staff activities. So we're going to have a staff report back, and that will cover things that we have learned as part of the implementation efforts. As more companies have been using SASB standards in reporting, we have learned a lot through engaging with them and the process. We also have a survey results from what we have outreach we've done with our standards advisory group, which we will be discussing today. There's been a global gap analysis thinking about the global usefulness of the standards and the metrics that are part of that. And we've been looking at our materiality map as well, and things that we've learned there. And then we have ongoing involvement with other standard setting organizations. One of those is through the corporate reporting dialogue, and we will be discussing today some what we have learned as part of the Better Alignment project that we were involved with at the CRD. And all of that is really a wonderful opportunity for us to learn more about the usefulness of our standards. Really we think about that in 2 particular ways, the usefulness to investors and also the cost effectiveness to companies that are reporting out against those metrics and standards. So it's all helpful input to us, and we have a process that we use at SASB to go about considering the changes to the standards that we could potentially make, as well as maintaining them in general. And so we think of the process as being a project-driven approach where we take input from, of course, the views of the Standards Board and the staff that works on these issues, but also, very importantly, from market input. And the market input can come from companies, investors, other organizations that are out there, and directly from the Standards Advisory Group as a regular source of feedback for us. All of that influences the work that we do here at SASB, and so some of what will come out of that input is potential projects that could be developed into proposals to revise the standards in a way that would result in improvement. So we've got, ultimately, the standard setting work that we do will be done in a transparent way, and so there's due process that our rules of procedure require in terms of how we make decisions, how we approve standards to that, and the outreach that we do as part of informing that process. We do have an opportunity to do preliminary work on some types of projects in order to inform whether or not that would be helpful and whether it could lead to a specific standard setting project that would be put before the board. So that's our research program. But in general, the way I think about the way we think about criteria for potential agenda items that SASB could be working on, the first most important thing is mission alignment, where where we think about whether there's an opportunity to significantly improve communication by companies to investors on sustainability issues that would be decision useful to both capital allocation and the stewardship decisions that companies, that investors make as part of their owning shares in companies and investing in them. We then think about mission alignments being informed by the changes, helping to achieve the SASB's mission by focusing on potential projects and asking what is the scope of the issue, how prevalent is it, is this something that is pervasive, affects many industries, is a very important theme, and again for that we do always look to our stakeholders, which includes companies and investors as well as other subject matter experts that are out there that can inform us on how important issues are and are likely to then be for investors and companies to think about. And of course, we have to think about capacity as well. And so we have to utilize our resources wisely. So we think about capacity there. And that is part of our due process as well. We know that there are different types of projects that we can work on, some of which don't require much due process because they are fairly straightforward technical corrections to standards. Others are potentially much bigger issues that could lead to substantial changes in our standards. And so would go through extensive research and due process before we would make those sorts of changes or consider them. And so ultimately, this is all meant to lead to proposals for projects that we could work on that would lead to improved standards. So we have a framework for thinking about what those standard setting projects might be, and they range from the governance issues that guide the work that we do, through to technical protocol updates, which could be particularly narrow and focused, but important to lead to comparable reporting out by companies. So Brian Esterly, who is one of the directors of the research team, is going to comment some more on how we think about the types of projects that we can potentially work on as that work.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. Reiterating a couple of Jeff's comments on the purpose and objective for this board meeting, and from the staff perspective, the opportunity set for projects, updates, potential improvements to the standards is vast. The staff has spent a lot of time through a lot of different engagements and projects and activities throughout the course of this year and since codification, gathering market input, conducting further research, analyzing the codified standards. And the indication to us is that there are, we're comfortable and view the codified standards as a very, very kind of strong position to be in. We're looking out forward into the future, whether that is identifying some more minor corrections that might need to take place in the standards as they exist today, to looking at big, evolving, emerging issues and how they may impact corporate valuation, investment portfolios, and how to account for that within the SASB standards. And so point being, the opportunity set is vast. And so what staff asks for from the board in coming out of this board meeting is clarity on priorities for the standard setting agenda. Jeff described the criteria that the board will use in order to make determinations on individual projects. And before that, or a level above that, is we need to have a reasonable level of alignment on what types of areas across the set of SASB standards the board views as priorities for staff to focus on and to develop projects around. In order to help facilitate this discussion or this alignment around agenda priorities, we've developed this framework with 11 different categories, as you see here. One comment, while I'm using the term categories, how we've increasingly started to view these 11 items is more in the way of characteristics They're not so much categories as discrete, mutually exclusive categories as they are characteristics that any one single project may have, and one project may have multiple of these characteristics. So from staff perspective, this is a useful framework for identifying the characteristics that the board feels are top priority, and then communicating back to staff to help allocate staff resources and time and effort for, again, developing projects and driving updates and improvements to the standard. So with that said, the board will see these 11 different categories or characteristics multiple times, many times throughout the course of this meeting, both today and tomorrow. And towards the end of the meeting, the latter portion tomorrow, we will look to the board for to start to move in the direction and start to coalesce around what these priority categories or characteristics are. With that said, Jeff described multiple sources of input that staff will spend today reporting back out on. We encourage you all to keep thinking how the information that we are reporting back to you and providing you ties to these categories or characteristics. What we are saying, lots of times what the market is saying, what staff hears from companies, what staff hears from investors, what staff sees in our own research indicates in terms of the relative importance of these 11 different areas. So we encourage you to all keep this framework in mind, and we will also do the same on our side. For example, if you're indicating the importance of a certain data point that we provide you with, we may ask you how you interpret it through this lens. To the extent that's helpful for you all and for staff to drive toward alignment around agenda prioritization.
Thanks, Brian. So just to wrap up some of this opening discussion, I would make it crystal clear that what we're talking about is today and tomorrow in our open board meetings. We are not proposing specific changes. We're not voting on changes for the standards today. In fact, what we're doing today is getting input on what we've heard back essentially from the marketplace on the standards and thinking about ways in which we can make improvements to the standards. And we're going to tomorrow be discussing what some specific projects might look like, but again, not making any specific proposed changes. Really today and tomorrow talking about how we are going to really kick off the start of thinking of ways to make our standards better for the marketplace. And that will be done with extensive research, outreach, and due process, and so that the marketplace understands clearly and has an opportunity to weigh in on anything before we do make substantive changes to our standards. So with that, this first session that we have today, we're going to be going through implementation status feedback, the SAG survey, and the global gap analysis. We'll start off with the implementation status.
Jeff, can I just ask briefly before we move into implementation status, is it helpful if we take a quick minute and kind of make sure we're all clear on these 11 different areas, or do you feel like the board has a reasonable level of clarity by what staff means and how we're communicating these?
I'll ask the board if they have any points of uncertainty around this.
Well, it might be useful for those listening. I don't know if any of us want to admit that we're not familiar with it.
For the listeners,
I can take a brief minute. When we say governance documents, number one, we're primarily referring to the rules of procedure and the conceptual framework. So, of course, the latter, the conceptual framework establishing the purpose and objectives of the SASB standards, the rules of procedure, how we seek to accomplish those objectives by way of the standard setting process. For 2 and 3, when we say thematic issue, could also call that cross-cutting issue, an issue that expands beyond the scope of one industry and potentially, how it plays out or how it impacts whether it's all 77 SASB industries or some greater set than one single industry or sector for that matter. Materiality, more looking at more at the disclosure topic level, and measurement looking at it more at the metric level. 4 through 6, when we say industry standard, we're thinking about a project through the lens of one specific industry, potentially one specific sector, but establishing the scope much more narrowly than the entire universe of SASB standards. And as you can see, 4 and 5 are the similar concepts, again, of materiality or topic versus measurement or metric. And both compliance in these standards today. Number 6 being focused on evaluating new or emerging issues that may not be found anywhere in the SASB standards, or maybe new and emerging issues that are captured in some industries, but not others. In terms of number 7, thinking about the definition and scope of industries, and with issues such as evolving business models or potentially industry operations, corporate operations that may not be well accounted for in any of the 77 industry standards. That's what a project in that area may look like. Globalization means essentially when we have a topic or metric that may have limitations around geographic applicability, projects falling into that realm. Technical protocol issues, that may be an example like what you articulated earlier, Jeff, of if we have, do not view any issues with the topic nor metric, but then when we see the underlying methodology or the technical protocol behind the metric, and we see an opportunity for improvement, that could look something like a technical correction process, like what Jeff indicated earlier, could have a varying level or a lesser degree of due process if it might be addressing a straightforward error, something that could be done in a very quick and straightforward manner. Standards application guidance, just want to take a moment again to remember the importance of the standards application guidance as part of the standards themselves that accompanies all 77 standards and provides companies with guidance on implementing the standards to the extent that we need to think about revisions or potentially expansions to the scope of what the application guidance addresses. And then alignment, thinking about whether it's other frameworks or other standard setters or industry-based metrics or initiatives, areas where there may be an opportunity to improve alignment while also improving the compliance with the SASB conceptual framework. So quick overview, happy to take any questions, or we can just move into the implementation status.
Since I launched this, maybe just a quick, the 10th item, the standards application guidance, that refers to an existing document that might be modified. I think there's a lot of interest in applications guidance more generally. Would that take in creating other kinds of documents or giving other kinds of guidance, or do you see that as a different category?
So I think of the feedback that we're hearing from the marketplace being informative on whether or not there's a potential change to the standards that would be helpful, whether or not we could provide clarity to how the standards ought to be implemented or utilized, and that if it's that, then if it would be broadly applicable to the way all standards could be used, it would go in the application guidance. And then there are probably also opportunities to help the marketplace to better understand how our standards can be used, as opposed to whether, how they would be utilized within companies. And for that, there are a number of thought pieces where we have different types of outlets through SASB that can help the marketplace to use our standards in a way that is more effective. And that wouldn't necessarily involve standard setting efforts at all, but probably would involve the efforts of our research team. So as a reminder, this framework is a way of thinking about traits that different types of projects might have. And so as we go through the feedback today, and then as we see potential types of projects tomorrow, we'll be hearing over and over some of these different traits and how they relate to what we're hearing back, as well as what we could potentially be working on. With that, I'll turn it back to Brian to dive into the implementation status and how implementation has informed what we now know about our standards.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. I will start this session out, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Anton Gorodinek, who is the lead analyst on the team, and he will go into some more detail on this topic. But to start out at a high level, SASB monitors corporate use and disclosures around the SASB standards. And so one high-level data point we will start out with, and we continually or regularly provide the board with updates on, is what we refer to as SASB references. As a reminder, SASB reference is a corporate communication or a disclosure provided by a company that simply references SASB. It does not necessarily mean that they're reporting using the SASB standard. It could mean that, but it may mean much more of a high level or early stage type of reference, something like the SASB considers or refers to the SASB standards as a source of input into a materiality assessment or into something else for that matter. So it's a very high level data point, but with that said, staff use this as an indicator of market interest and a very early stage indicator of market uptake of the SASB standards. And so as we can see, a pretty strong favorable trend line here, where year to date so far, we have 416 source documents published by 314 companies that reference SASB in some way. That number is actually even more than what we saw at this point year to date in 2018. And so the chart there is even a little bit misleading, because if we look at a year over year or same period comps, then it would be substantially more than what we see there, given that we're not all the way through the calendar year here. So anyway, the trend line is positive, and we continue to see nothing but more, and if anything, just an increasing rate of corporate references to SASB. What we also see is very wide geographic distribution, and so the majority of about 2/3 of SASB references come from companies outside of the U.S. Almost 2/3, 37% come from companies domiciled in the U.S. So a substantial portion of these references, 28%, are from European domiciled companies, 20% companies based in Asia.
Brian, the region description there, is that their stated headquarters country?
Correct. A bit more of a granular data point is what we refer to as SASB reporters. And so these are companies that are reporting using the SASB standard. It may be varying levels of implementation. It may be a rather early stage implementation of the SASB standards, or it may be a much more robust, comprehensive implementation or compliance with the SASB standard for that matter. So putting aside the issue of the varying levels of quality of implementation aside for a moment here, the same themes that we saw on the prior slide hold true, if not even more true in terms of the trend that we're seeing here. We see 94 unique reporters since 2017, 67 unique SASB reporters year to date in 2019, thus far year to date, and that actually compares with 30 at the same period last year. So these numbers are for August 31st. By August 31st of 2018, there were 30 SASB reporters at that point. There are over 2 times that, 67 year to date 2019. An interesting part about that number 67 that we see so far is 57 of those companies are new SASB reporters, so has never reported using the SASB standards before. A couple quick comments just to make sure we orient ourselves appropriately, or at least just share how staff views this data, is that while the trend line is positive and exciting to see, we know that the market is it's very large, and we're at the very early days and being less than a year away from the codification of the SASB standards. So while this is positive to see, it's useful information. I think we still keep in mind the broader context here and the broader market, and a lot of useful input has come in from these companies that have implemented the standards thus far, but also making sure we're the companies and the sources of input for staff are much broader than what we see here. Point being, any company that moves forward with beginning to implement the SASB standards is a very positive sign. Again, varying levels of quality of implementation, but regardless, any company taking steps moving forward is a positive sign, and also enables SASB staff with more the potential for more useful or effective input, as it indicates companies have really spent time understanding the SASB standard and often have much more granular or nuanced feedback on the standard. And so unless there are any questions, with that said, I will pass it over to Anton.
Brian, maybe Anton too, but so where does reporter end and mentioner begin? So what I mean is we sort of tracking, here are all the reporters, but here are all the times SASB is mentioned by a company. So a company might just say, we considered the SASB standards, maybe they reported none. Another company could report all of the standards, another company could report partial standards. So when do you stop saying someone's a reporter?
Mm-hmm.
And when do you start saying they're a mentioner? So for example, if I only reported one standard for my company, would I be a reporter?
Mm-hmm.
One topic.
The SASB reporters category or methodology includes companies that are so-called partial reporters using a portion of the SASB standard. That's a good question, Bob. I think it's consistent with how, while this is useful data, really there's a lot of nuance behind it in terms of the level of comprehensiveness of implementation of the standard.
But you can think of it as requiring that they have both reported out information that we ask for in a standard, as well as saying that they're doing so because they're reporting out on a SASB metric. So it really requires that they're producing some information and that they're saying it's SASB information.
Correct. They need to positively confirm that this disclosure is based on or is consistent or compliant with the SASB standard, and that leads to certain metrics.
And this is, again, not something that we ask companies to report back to us. We don't approve of any or disapprove of any of this. Our standards are out there for companies freely to utilize, and this is a way in which we track the degree of use of our standards in the marketplace.
So just to put a fine point on it, would you have to be reporting at least one metric in a topic under your industry, or could you just be discussing a topic for your industry that was identified as a topic?
You would have to be reporting at least one metric. With that said, some metrics are qualitative based in discussion analysis, so there's some nuance there as well.
And then also, you wouldn't just report it in a discussion if it happens to be aligned with a different standard. You'd have to say, we're reporting this because it's in the SASB standard. That's why we're reporting it.
And really, this is, again, just a nuance in the way that we track the use of the standards, as opposed to what we're requiring or encouraging in terms of behavior.
So I just want to start by reiterating the point that Brian made about the fact that as we see the increasing number of companies using SASB standard in the market, it's a very positive sign. Having said that, we really try to understand the extent to which companies really understand our standards and use the standards. And here there's some of the observations that we are seeing. So number one is there's a pretty meaningful range in terms of quality of disclosure using SASB standards. So that relates to both like the understanding of the structure of the standard, the format in which companies choose to report the standards. And as we really try to maintain a relationship with companies that have used the SASB standards, we try to dig deeper in understanding their approach and the challenges that they face. And that's where comes the second observation here, an insufficient understanding of the standard itself, and specifically the robustness of the technical protocols that we have behind individual metrics, essentially the suitable criteria of the standard. Having said that, we currently do have the standards application guidance. That's essentially the document that is meant to help companies really understand and navigate through the use of the SASB standards and indicate the existence of technical protocols to help them guide through reporting. Yet, unfortunately, as indicated by the feedback that we have received, there's still a little bit of lack of awareness of the existence of the guidance. And even though the guidance exists, unfortunately, it still does not really address all the practical challenges that companies face on their way to implementing SASB standards. Specifically, those relate to the use of multiple standards. And we're going to speak about that a little bit more. Also about challenges with some unique industry structures, companies like Uber and Lyft, for example, where do you think of fitting them into the existing industries? And then also companies really have a lot of questions about the best practices in terms of the format of disclosure, the channel, and whether it's an index, whether it's a standalone report. And of course, the globalization as a theme really comes through here as well, the existence of guidance for companies that may not necessarily have operations within the US. Having said that, there is also a fourth observation, which is important, and we could think about how to take that forward. But essentially, companies that kind of were able to overcome most of these challenges and put out reports of good quality with those that were able to involve multiple departments within the organization, so bringing to the table their financial reporting, legal, investor relations, sustainability, and those that have used external third-party review, such as assurance audit, were really those highlighted as best practices in implementing of SASB standards. So overall theme I want to also mention here is that we are an independent standard setter, and we can later discuss our role we have to play here, but we think it's really important to facilitate investor feedback directly with companies and also through SASB as an intermediary through the use of Standards Advisory Group and Investor Advisory Group to really help companies move in the right direction in terms of aligning the quality to help us achieve our mission on providing decision useful information to investors as primary users. So this slide kind of speaks to the one area of implementation input that we receive specifically from companies that have used SASB standards. The next slide. Yes,
jump in on
sure.
on the prior one for a second?
Yep.
Just one comment, one question. On what is the best format of disclosure, something I hear in the market all the time is where should this disclosure take place? I get that question all the time, so I don't know if that's encompassed in format, but that's something that I get all the time.
Yep.
It should be in the regulatory filing, somewhere else, whatever. So that's something I hear. And if you could just hum a couple more bars on number 4, like including a third-party review as a leading practice. Is that something that we're identifying as a leading practice, or that the feedback is it seems to be that it's a leading practice among the people that you're talking to? And just a couple more, just a little bit more color around that number 4.
Yeah, so and maybe Tom could chime in on the assurance part here, but that's something that we are hearing from companies as the feedback. Again, it's for the board potential to discuss later on the side that we should take on the assurance, the official view. In terms of the format, yes, we definitely hear a lot of questions on where the channel of disclosure. We always try to reference back the take that Matthew had in one of the blog posts that he wrote about quality over the channel of disclosure, and that I think kind of gets back to the number 2 and number 3. Kind of, it's not so much like where you choose to, as long as you actually go and integrate it as intended.
I'll just share a very brief comment on kind of a purpose of talking about third-party review here, is that SASB staff reviews virtually all SASB-based reports or disclosures that come out. And to us, it at least anecdotally at this point appears that there's a stronger level of compliance with the standard and comprehensiveness or robustness when there might be some level of third-party review. With that said, staff is conducting more of a systematic analysis right now as we speak, to have this be more of a data-driven observations and conclusions. Tying this then back to the line at the very bottom of the slide is critical, that investor feedback is paramount here, and that it's not necessarily, at least the staff views, it's not necessarily our determination on what is the most appropriate format, presentation, review, and so forth. It's what investors need. And so we want to be able to supply investors with the right data in order to enable them to provide the right feedback directly to companies or through SASB as an intermediary, advisory groups that we have, in order to help make that information more apparent and more accessible to companies in making some of these determinations around format, location, assurance, and so forth.
Mark, so one of the things I understand is that, Bloomberg or something was, in some of the, scoring companies, one of the line items is third-party assurance. And in the way they score it, you get an uptick that translates into a higher number if you have third-party assurance. And I think we want to use the word third-party assurance. And there's really kind of two standards. There's the ISO standard and then the AICPA standard. So I have a question, and I know you've been looking at the reporting, and sometimes you question, did they follow the technical protocol or not? I know you've had calls with companies, which has really been great, and I think the fact we have the technical protocol makes this a much better accounting standard. Would you say that the misapplication of the standard or misreporting because they don't follow the technical protocol, is that a prevalent issue? Is it isolated? How big of an issue do you think it is where there's no third-party assurance, which you'd think they would kind of get in the technical? So how big of an issue is it that you think they're kind of missing the actual correct calculation and application versus it's an isolated group of companies?
Well, maybe I'll reframe this question a little bit to say, like, the way I see this is that, like, it is not easy to flip a switch and produce useful information. And so companies are on a journey to provide useful information to investors. And so to the extent that they can all be utilizing technical protocols, we believe that that is more likely to lead to comparable information. But you can sort of comment on to what extent you think like that's a challenge for companies.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a great point, Jeff. I think certainly right now, especially for us, as we are also not an insurance provider, it's hard to assess quantitatively to what extent companies, quote unquote, complies with the technical protocol or not. We can only do some high level overview whether, the intent of the metric can be met or not. That's why it's really important for us to kind of highlight that the point that having third-party assurance done and really having technical protocol there fitting the criteria that were outlined in the conceptual framework, and the assurance providers have their suitable criteria, and they aligned pretty well. That's where I think it's a useful communications point with companies to help them understand the direction they should be going toward.
What's your sense of the prevalence of this? Acknowledge your point that we can only see what is published, but what's your sense of the prevalence?
So I think probably just in the number of reports that have reviewed, probably in more cases, more often than not, if you were to put a really high bar on assessing the compliance with the technical protocol, companies probably for the most part would not hit that bar.
And I wonder if this kind of illustrates that third-party assurance is kind of step 2. Step 1 is if you're going to make any kind of disclosure, you got to have controls in place to assure that that disclosure is accurate and conforms to whatever the underlying requirement.
Which we have in the application guide, which is really good. And I think we got that well articulated.
I think just to add on to it, and Anton's about to get into this as well, but it really is also an indication of where companies are, and as you said, Jeff, in terms of their implementation journey, where many of them are now assessing, okay, are these the right topics for me at the high level? Am I ready to report these metrics? And then increasingly, as they move to the technical protocol level, because they all do want to generally provide the most useful information to investors, that's why they're investing in reporting, that's where we're starting to see greater attention to and questions arising from technical protocols, which is a signal to us that some of the market has moved to that degree of analyzing the standards. So I think that is probably on your next slide.
Yeah, exactly. So the board has seen this slide, and the first time it was shown was earlier this year in February, I believe. Essentially, the previous slide kind of highlighted the feedback and observations that we've been getting from companies that have implemented SASB standards, but we still primarily have conversations with companies that have not yet. They either be SASB ready or they might be a little bit hesitant on using SASB standards, but we really try to collect and get a sense of the type of challenges that they're dealing with and where the areas where we could be helpful for them. And, I don't think it's probably fair to say that not much has changed since February, when we indicated, and again, here it's also not so much quantitative and science-based analysis of the magnitude and the frequency, but more of a kind of a sense where we hear these questions throughout questions on the panels or just conversations with companies. So most of the questions probably are still in this area of practical and presentation-related themes. And as David indicating, as companies start to really dig into technical protocols, that's where we start getting these more technical questions. And you know, it's probably fair to point out that, and that's why on one of the categories on that list of 11 prioritization categories of technical protocols, so that's something to consider for us. We also identifying areas where we're not perfect yet, and if companies really want to hit that high bar, there's some potential standards related changes need to happen. But essentially, the point here is that we really try to track this information to better understand where adoption is moving. And it's very important to point out here that we're talking about adoption, but it's really in the setting of the Standards Board meeting, and that's something that we discussed earlier about this dual role of the kind of our organization, is that we can really drive the adoption by achieving the primary goal of the standard setter and the Standards Board specifically, focusing actually on the content of the standard. And that's why we're really trying to track this information. And the way we do so is, on one hand, we focus on more frequently asked questions, implementation challenges. And you're going to be probably seeing this slide and different variations quite a bit today. But in the first way we track questions, it actually hits on 8 out of 11 prioritization categories. So we really try to get the questions related to fundamental issues and existence of topics, helping companies understand the approach that we have, which is general fundamental approach, questions related to globalization. So essentially everything that does not capture metrics or technical protocols. And then on the other hand, we really also track technical inquiries. So that relates more to companies that really dig deep into the understanding of the standards, into understanding our metrics, the rationale behind those metrics, very specific questions related to the definitions, the scope of disclosure, like clarifying, considering the different business models of companies that exist. And you will notice here, and that's something that will be coming up throughout the sessions today, is this globalization is highlighted on both of the slides. And because globalization can be seen as really a theme that can be coming up in really high-level conversations about the approach that we're taking, but also at a very, very in-depth level of technical protocols, where we really need to figure out these challenging issues where we might be referencing like US-centric regulations and things like that.
So this is all helpful context, and I think of it a little bit by analogy of, if we were creating a triathlon course, it's going to have a swim, a bike, and a run portion, which we would have thought carefully about and in anticipation of the event. But then when the course begins, people will be at different parts of the course, and partly, through implementation, we're hearing some issues. Those are not necessarily indicative of every part of the course, but really where the bulk of the participants happen to be at the moment. And since this is still, very early stage effort, we've got early stage users of the standards, and so we're hearing a lot about that, and some of it for the first time, as in different industries, we start to see some of the leaders in those industries in terms of reporting against these standards give us their feedback as they go through that process. So that's helpful for contextualizing, what we're hearing. It's partially a function of why it's available right now as opposed to, a year ago or in a year from now, what we might be hearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's perfect. And actually, it's a great segue to the next slide, which essentially we try to help you all understand how thinking through the lens of the types of questions that we're receiving and overlaying those 11 categories on prioritization for projects that might be put on the research agenda going forward. That's where essentially we're trying to map those categories and to show you this is only one of the many different inputs on prioritization, being the questions that we get from companies that are going to use SASB standards, or questions from companies that already using SASB standards in various ways. A couple things I would point out here is that when we were considering the questions that we were getting, it was hard to kind of place the questions related to the alignment, and David will speak to that later on, and we kind of put it as a cross-cutting theme rather than a category. Again, we now have also alignment category on the prioritization category, so we also can think about this as a theme. And as I mentioned earlier, globalization could be also really be more of a cross-cutting theme across multiple categories. Those could be focused on our governance of documents, where globalization is something that's really important to address in our conceptual framework, for example, but also all the way to the point of the technical protocol updates, where we really need to focus on their global applicability. Globalization is also that theme.
Just a quick comment or two. So just for clarity, the histogram at the top is meant to indicate that if a company has made the decision to improve their sustainability disclosures to investors, and they think SASB might be a reasonable tool to do so. Now, when they dive into the SASB standards, where do we see companies on this kind of spectrum to reporting? And even more so, where are companies facing roadblocks or challenges? So tomorrow, when we get into a discussion around agenda priorities, hypothetically, if staff says something along the lines of, we are not recommending that we prioritize issue or projects that seek to improve technical protocols, we may call back to this here and say that our data, our market intelligence is not indicating that technical protocols is a major obstacle to holding companies up to implementing the standards. With that said, we do get technical questions, and we do see some level of opportunity and challenge there. And so, can we still address those, remediate the challenges, or seek to address the opportunities? Potentially, but it's just an example of how we're going to keep trying to call back to these categories and use market data, use input in our research to help support where agenda priorities should be or maybe should not be.
So Brian, just to paraphrase you, I guess, the majority of focus and challenges right now are in the practical arena of how you fit the metrics to your business and how they apply and how to get the data and so forth. That's what people are sitting right now.
That's what we see based on this specific input, this kind of broadly defined input of staff interactions with market and staff observations of SASB reporters. We'll talk about other input, but that's spot on for our interpretation of what we're hearing and seeing from the market means to opportunities and agenda prioritization.
And I do want to ask, this is an illustration, I think, not specific feedback, but I want to clarify why the two materiality questions come up under here, conceptual and in a global context. Is this saying that the question of how to determine materiality is a globalization kind of concern that there's a market interpretation of maybe security regulation, kind of a market interpretation or definition of materiality, and that's something that's a topic coming up, or is this? I don't think this is saying that topics are different based on market. We still believe the topics are material based on industry.
Yeah.
Not by region, right?
Yeah, there might be a few exceptions, and we might touch on that a little bit later in the global gap analysis section. But yeah, so I wanted to touch a little bit on that. You might see that there are 4 categories tagged, well, kind of like 5 or 6 with the cross-cutting ones related to the conceptual piece. So that one is less about the approach to topic selection. It's more about very specific questions related why a certain topic is not included or included. It's just, this is a tricky category where not to confuse it specifically, I want to make sure that we don't confuse the conceptual feedback with the conceptual category, the governance documents, like conceptual framework and the rules of procedures. It's just when we get feedback from external stakeholders, they are unlikely to communicate it on the language that we use in SASB internally, kind of communicating about general issue categories and approach to sustainability versus business. topic is there, like what's the emerging issue. So it's unlikely that we're going to be hearing that in that language, but it's important for us to think about that as potential like conceptual issues related to existence of certain topics.
Conceptual, practical presentation, and the rest could almost be alternatively labeled what, why, and how, you know.
Exactly.
First questions people come up with when they're thinking about this is like, what are you talking about? And ask them what questions. And then,
Exactly.
you know, later they have the, well, so something like that, like a what, why, and how type of,
Yeah.
more of the what and why earlier on, and more of the how and where later on, you know, are subsequent questions.
Yeah, that's all for me. So probably Marvin next.
Perfect. Unless any other questions on that?
No, it sounds like we'll be seeing more of this as well, so we can certainly come back.
Great, thanks, Anton, and I think that's a good segue to the information that I'll be sharing about the SAG survey feedback report. So I'm very excited to share an update on the recent survey that we sent out to Standards Advisory Group members. And really, the survey was designed to understand their experiences using the SASB standards. So it wasn't framed from the perspective of using the terminology that we might use on the research team or even on the standards board.
And also, could you quickly just, you know, recap the SAG? You know, what is the SAG?
Yeah, no, great. Thanks, Jeff. So the Standards Advisory Group is a standing committee of volunteer industry experts from corporations, financial institutions, and other organizations as well, other subject matter experts who provide ongoing feedback to the research team and the Standards Board, both about the implementation and use of the standards, as well as specific content related to the standards relevant to their industry. So yeah, we really focused on designing a survey that would be from their perspective and walk them through how they might start to finish use the standards either as an issuer or as someone who's leveraging the content from the report for their investment decision making. The goal of the survey was to get insights that could help inform our agenda prioritization efforts. But as we continue to look into the data, we anticipate that there will be some more insights that we glean that will help inform maybe some other aspects of our work and thinking. One thing that I think it's really important to note with this is that this is the starting point of a conversation. So really what the survey data gives us is insights on where we need to have more conversations. It's not really the final end all be all. And I think it's also worth noting that there are some limitations to the survey, right? So this group is self-selecting. These are people who can have an above average understanding of SASB and the SASB standards, and that might not accurately reflect the market. Another thing worth noting is that this is a limited sample size when you start to look at the industry level. So overall, there's some key themes that we can take away, but we got a handful of responses from many industries. And so again, it's more information for us to dive into later and is kind of just a signal from some of our key stakeholders. So overall, we were very pleased with the responses that we received. We received responses from 95 SAG members and their colleagues. That's out of the then 174 members. Of those, 68% were corporate and 27% filled out the investor survey. So we had a separate survey for corporates and investors, understanding that we would have to have different questions for them, given that they have different experiences using the standards. And the percentage breakdown of the professional function of each group mirrors closely the breakdown of the professional function of the Standards Advisory Group members. So I think as we continue to dive into certain topics, we may want to focus more exclusively on certain professional functions to make sure that we have more of a balance of perspectives there.
On the investor front, I just want to commend, I just think that this is phenomenal to have such a mix of different kinds of investors that we're getting feedback from, because as the investors on the board know, the investment community is not monolithic, and there's lots of different views amongst different kinds, and this represents a nice cross-section. So, kudos to pointing a good mix to the SAG, and it's great that you got engagement from so many of them from different parts.
So the survey scope touched on 9 of the 11 prioritization categories, and it's worth mentioning that with governance documents, we didn't specifically ask about them, so they were more actively excluded from the scope of the survey. Globalization was an interesting one because it wasn't actively excluded, but it could be because of the way that we framed questions and the responses that we'll have to do a deeper dive to better understand concerns there. So to give a concrete example, there were times when, and I'll get into this in more detail later, where there was feedback around ways in which companies wanted additional thinking around modifying metrics, but we don't know why they feel that they need to modify metrics. It could be that they feel that they're not globally applicable. So there's more research for us to do to really understand where the globalization piece fits in, and that's something that we'll do. So these were the key themes that we pulled out of the survey. Again, we're really taking a lot more time to dive into it, and I think as we look at the data longer, we'll start to see some more key themes emerge, but these are the ones that initially stood out the most. And really quickly, I'll just go through them before I talk about them in more detail, but there was a lot about application guidance. So the corporate respondents, this was a question that was geared towards them specifically, found that the guidance was useful, but also articulated that they would appreciate more. I'll touch on what they said that would be helpful for them. Overall, respondents found that the topics and metrics are relevant, financially material, and decision useful, so it's both on the corporate and investor side. With the technical protocol, respondents were overall familiar with the technical protocol, but also would appreciate more clarity there.
What does that mean?
That's one area that we'll get into in a little bit, but certainly something that we need to investigate more because I think we have to do a deeper dive to actually understand. Climate and human capital emerged as the most prevalent thematic issues that the stakeholders suggested that we should investigate further in our research prioritization efforts. And then there were also some comments around industry scope and structure. So particularly those that operate across multiple industries felt that there were opportunities for us to improve the industry descriptions there.
Could you categorize the general industry guidance as they need more than 77?
I think that many of them felt that they were unclear about how to determine what other industries they should consider reporting using. So
choosing multiple.
Choosing multiple,
okay.
More so than the addition or subdividing even more.
So, but it does seem like there's some of that as well.
There is some of that as well, yeah.
But maybe some further work on how to help conglomerates, multi-industry companies get to this. You know, right now we're not real clear what to do and how to go about, perhaps if you're somebody that does multiple business lines, how to aggregate which metrics to use for the industry.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say with the application guidance, I think there was a mix of responses where some of it would be considered more of a standard setting recommendations for us to look into more. And then other sets of feedback were more around communication and us making sure that we are guiding potential reporters to the right resources that are currently existing somewhere on our website. So it's a little bit of a mix of both types of feedback.
We're gonna go through all these anyway, so we'll come back.
So of the corporate SAG members who filled out the survey, 87% said that they were familiar with the standards applications guidance, and 94% said that they found it helpful of that 87% that were familiar. So very positive response overall. We saw that 72% of respondents asked for additional guidance, and the types of guidance that they asked for we kind of bucketed based on these different categories here. There's some nuance in each of those, but at a high level, these were some of the key themes that emerged.
Well, just from my experience with the SASB, that is not unusual, right? That people like the application guidance, they find it helpful, and that they want more. So, you know, I just don't want to raise the level of expectations that, you know, when we do more of it, that they'll be satisfied. Yeah, that's about right. No, they'll always say they want more of it to fit their fact patterns, and that's fine. So there's always a tension behind it.
That's a great point, Mark. I think that speaks to where this would really signal to us, let's dive in and figure out if there's something that's particularly high yield for us to invest our time on, and understand that, yeah, we can probably produce guidance for the rest of our careers and still need to produce more.
And I think also just thinking of ways in which we can make it clear and easy for those who are pulling down industry standards to see that there's application guidance that's applicable,
Yeah.
right? And so, a loop back, the front page or the metrics table, also having a line say, a hot link saying like link here for the guidance, just to make it, crystal clear that there's just that we do have more help that's available for understanding how to use the work that we've done.
Great point.
And here are just a few specific examples of comments that we saw under different types of categories. So the first really references case studies and people wanting to see more concrete examples of how others navigated implementation, which is something that has come up before and I know we've thought a lot about internally and are working on. There were also comments around integration, so thinking about the data requested, calculation methodology, and aligning with existing reporting standards and frameworks. And then there was another comment about the level of disclosure, so requesting additional guidance around the level of detail that was being requested. So these are just a few of the many comments that we've received, but I think they're somewhat representative of just those few categories. So when looking at the technical protocols, we found that respondents were overall familiar with the technical protocol. But 44% of corporate respondents felt like there was a need for more clarity. And Kurt, to get to your earlier question, the responses that were provided didn't give us a lot of clarity as to what additional clarity was needed. So that's the follow-up for us to dive into and to look into more. And that'll be one of the
follow-ups.
Need to be
clear about their needs and clarity.
Exactly, yeah. And then we can improve our clarity.
We'll ask them to clarify what needs to be clarified.
So to be clear, the surveys were slightly different for the investor members versus the issuers and or corporate companies. And the companies were asked about application guidance. The investors weren't asked about application guidance. So did we ask investors about?
We did ask the investors about the application guidance, but the way that it was framed was a little bit different in the survey.
And then we asked both about we asked both about the technical protocols.
Well, not surprisingly, the corporates that are actually working on this stuff are much deeper into the technical protocols.
They need to
Exactly, yeah.
And like this comment would have to be addressed technical protocol by technical protocol. And as there isn't sort of a broad comment, we'll make these technical protocols clearer. You'd have to look at the specific one that someone was familiar with.
Although
what they thought was missing.
One way to interpret the data that we are seeing from this particular survey is that most companies, I think, identify a particular standard that they were most familiar with, although there's some companies obviously are using more than one standard. Financial sector companies are a great example. You get more investors saying that they're familiar with multiple standards because of the nature of the work that they're doing.
Yeah, and Jeff, one thing that you reminded me of that I neglected to mention earlier is that this survey was anonymous. So we did have them fill out their primary industries of focus, but allowed them to only opt in if they wanted to share who they were at the end of the survey. So there are some areas where we're not exactly sure who said it, but we at least have a sense of the industry that they're coming from. Didn't notice any industry-specific trends, but that goes to my earlier point about being a relatively small sample size as well. So overall, the survey respondents found that the topics were both relevant and financially material, and it was relatively consistent with breakdown between the corporate respondents and the investors.
So this topic at the top and it says metric is below.
Okay, yeah. To clarify, that is topic.
Topics. So it's interesting to me that it was all 85, 88% but that there still is what I would anticipate, actually, that there would be a corporate versus investor gap there. And I think when usually in other experience that I've seen, investors are more likely to say this would be useful material information than companies themselves. So we are seeing that even though not in the percentage overall, that falls into the yes, roughly like the yes bucket.
And then going to metrics. Overall, respondents found that they were applicable, decision useful, and comparable. There is a gap both in the decision usefulness and the comparability of metrics between the corporate respondents and the investors. I don't think that that is really a surprise to us, but it is something that we could seek to better understand as we have follow-up conversations.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is even more of that typical gap that I would expect to be there, but so I don't know that we can eliminate a gap which is just pervasively there in general, but we certainly can understand where the drivers, because part of it might be some of like the unique view that companies have about the nature of their operations, their particular operations, and yet and wanting to get that message across, but investors are thinking, yes, I may get that unique view, but also I need to be able to benchmark you against your peers, and so need a degree of comparability, and so that's very helpful for me, and that might be one source of where the gap is coming from.
Just sharing one interpretation of this, Jeff and Marvin and the full board here. They're calling back to the 11 categories for prioritization. If hypothetically staff comes forward and says, maybe reevaluating existing content in terms of materiality metrics or materiality of topics or metrics might be lower priorities, and these could be reasonable data points that we base those view on. If 85% of corporate respondents believe that the topics are strongly agree that the topics are financially material or somewhat agree, and a similar 88% of investors feel that way. And then similar types of data points for metrics here. So the point being that this should tell us something. It's only one source of input, but it should tell us something about prioritization of reevaluating the content in the standards now compared to the opportunity set of projects that we can work on. So just keeping that framework in mind.
Which is not to say that there might be quick, easy wins on in some respects where it's narrow, but it doesn't suggest a broad thematic issue.
And I think that goes back to where Marvin really astutely observed that a lot of the value from this is going to be that subsequent deep dive to tease out those specific issues that may have led to some of the lower responses.
But, I think overall, it's still on the decision usefulness and comparability to get that almost 2/3 of the corporate thinking that these are useful. I think that that's great. Now, I think that also does harken back to the demographics of the people that we got on the survey. These are the sustainability folks mostly getting that feedback, and as Kurt pointed out, the financial folks might have a different view of that. But it's, even still, I think that there's usually a gap, and as Jeff pointed out, I think it's usually bigger.
Great. So moving on, about half of all respondents believe that there are at least some issues that are relevant or emergent that have not been sufficiently addressed in the relevant industry standards. So the breakdown varies a little bit between the investor response and the corporate response, where the corporates feel more strongly that there are issues that should be considered for inclusion and updates to the standard.
My takeaway from some of the specific comments some of the respondents shared was that they have incumbent metrics that they are currently reporting that are not in the SASB standard because they haven't passed their market feedback test or for some other reason. And so it seems like they want to see those reinforced through SASB, which may or not be appropriate.
So it certainly could be a source of where we think about, a data point from the marketplace on what may be valuable, but again, factored against the other priorities that we have. But it is interesting, and it is interesting to see it. This is perhaps the most dramatic investor-company gap.
To me, I reacted to this, I thought this was really important, because, this is, where we're trying to go is to close that gap as much as we can. We'd love this answer to be about zero. Now, you can also argue that emergent is not yet material, or has not yet emerged. I wondered, we didn't ask the question, belief in existence of existing issues, not in topics. If you let's say they covered their decision use material. So, we might try to think about that. I mean, this was a great way for us to begin to get our leading indicators as to where we might be moving. Also, whether it's incumbent reporting or not, it might be interesting to figure out. So, if you really, what were you expecting to be in our standards that aren't? So, I thought this was a very good question, and should be. If we can get more feedback on this, I think it'll give us some insight into where we ought to go. But the other part would be, do people think there's something that's just not in the standards?
So we did ask that question as well. Both questions are there. Yeah.
Do we have that coming up? Or not?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Great. So the follow-up was, what are these issues that you believe should be considered? And the number one answer, particularly from the corporate audience, was around environment. So life cycle management, hazardous waste, microplastics is an issue that came up quite a bit, as well as human capital. So those were the top two thematic issues. And climate adaptation and risk was right behind, along with social capital, which was more human rights in the supply chain and less around the human capital issues around employee engagement, retention, diversity and inclusion. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to dive deeper into some of these issues to really understand more of the nuance of what their thoughts are there. The responses tend to be a little bit higher level, so excited to dive in more.
Right, so is this your interpretation of all of the detailed comments that's on page 48?
Yes, this is our interpretation of the detailed comments, pulling out some themes, bucketing them together, but it may be that in subsequent conversations that we have with stakeholders, we better understand their concerns and we kind of shift.
I think that's right. I was wondering how that fits in here.
Yeah. And respondents, a decent selection of respondents felt that their industry description didn't accurately capture their business model. So that was for a couple of different reasons. We touched on some of them earlier, but there was some around their feeling that the uniqueness of their business model meant that the industry description was insufficient, or having challenges around choosing multiple industries and not feeling as if there was sufficient guidance there to help them understand.
Does this mean I think there should be a 78 industry for them, or
It's a mix of different types of feedback. So it's sometimes that the current description they feel like doesn't accurately capture their business model.
Yeah, maybe to say this slightly differently. Some of what I've heard in talking with companies is it becomes pretty clear that they actually sometimes just feel like there's a stumbling block in the literal text that's used to describe their industry. And if that is a stumbling block and bubbles up to a decision maker, that could sort of stop them from sort of moving forward with something. And they may never get to the point where they look actually at the topics and do a gap analysis against their business model. So sometimes it's the wording, and that's actually important for us to know, because that's a really easy fix for us if we think that we can make a change to just the language that is used to describe an industry to better reflect the way that the industry sort of sees itself. Other times it is more about the business model and how it maps to the topics that have been identified for that industry. And there are two types there. And I think of it as like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's either in a sense, like the industry is too broad or too narrow for their business model. And that's, again, important for us to understand that distinction, because we can try to address that need through different mechanisms, because it wouldn't be the same mechanism for either one. So if it is, you are a holding company that happens to have 8 different distinct types of operations that you're a holding company for, and you want to report at the holding company level, I bet your financial reporting is complicated and hard to use at the aggregate level of the holding company. That's because you are a complicated security to invest in. And that would be no less true for sustainability reporting for that holding company. But what we can do is we can help to provide guidance on how they can go about identifying what would be, like, how do they think through the, what we mean by a primary industry for your company. And is it one, or is it the ones that are significant in a sense? So we need some language around that as well as guidance. If it is and I think the pharmaceuticals industry is a great example, if it is some of what we see as an issue is that, like, there are like a significant number of businesses that are more specialized than or maybe not reflective of the typical business model that was thought of in developing the industry standard. It may suggest that there needs to be a split or a reorganization or potentially an additional type of industry. So that just suggests a different potential solution, or that we provide additional guidance to companies on how to think about the decision to omit or modify metrics related to distinction in their business model relative to what the industry standard was.
Yeah, really, the first quote, I think, is the essence of it. We just need to provide a way for companies to report under multiple areas. Maybe give them some advice on the mechanism to do it, and kind of a framework, so that it's not, today we're kind of leaving it open how they do that. And I would think that, it's probably something that would ease adoption. So we say 70% of my business is this, 30% is that, or at least allow them some kind of a structure to, in good faith, better describe the
It might, but again, I don't think the complicated business models are our only issue here. I think it is some of the specialized ones as well. But saying here's how you can pick all the models that would be useful might not encourage companies. Like, they might be looking for an easier, less costly way to report. They may not like the fact that because they're a complicated industry, there may be, our standards won't be as efficient a way to communicate for a company that's a complicated company.
I wonder how much we're not clear, they're not reading. Because I seem to recall in our implementation guide, because we talk about that, you should look at what industry you're in, you could be in multiple ones. I think maybe we need to add more words. It's sort of up to you to determine.
But that's soft terminology. I think we need something more tangible. I think say, here's an example of how you do it.
We need
maybe a structure that allows companies to put that together. So
we need to help them. And as the academic in me, who gets anonymous peer-reviewed feedback all the time, the gut is to say, is this a problem with my writing or the reviewer's reading? But the reality is, if it's the reviewer's reading, it is still always a problem with our writing. So,
There's only one way to change it.
there's only one way to change it.
And I do think that we have 2 things that are true and are going to stay true. One is that this thing is completely founded on these industries, the whole conceptual basis of it, and that maps to how the investment world works and a lot of other things. But it's also true most companies don't fit very well. Some of the largest companies, Apple, Microsoft, and Google, are in 3 separate industries and directly compete. Bob Iger just left the board of Apple because now Apple can compete directly with Disney. So this problem will also never go away. We're going to have these guys in multiple industries. And one of the prime selling points of what we're doing here is the efficiency of it, that we're picking out, the high impact items. So it sounds like if you take that along with what you said earlier about practical guidance, this just needs to be an area of emphasis, not just of explaining ourselves, but maybe also doing some R&D on what is the best way for a company to pick and choose topics and metrics from across the industry standard?
Two brief comments here. So we or staff will interpret these comments as indicators of interest in prioritizing application guidance. Just want to be very direct on that. Get one thing right. Okay. So that's number one. Maybe caveat to that is we have a lot of things we need to do or want to do. But clear indicators of interest from the board and application guidance. Point taken. Number two, just recalling some conversations we had in some of the public board meetings last year prior to codifying the standards when we were agreeing on the application guidance. And we discussed some of these issues, and we decided to keep that guidance, that multi-industry guidance language, quite broad and high level, exactly to accomplish this, figure out to what extent and degree do companies need more guidance, and then conduct research and analysis and market input to help inform that guidance and if that meets investor needs. And so just calling back to prior discussions in public board meetings around the application guidance where this was a known issue, that this would likely happen at some point, and we would have to make a decision around when was the right time to build out more guidance.
And we certainly have already learned, I think the financial sector, they provided a great case study, some of those companies, in thinking through the challenges and how to solve them, and so could both help us to inform as well as help us to also rethink what we're suggesting as a
Great. So this is just a recap of some of the key themes that we've gone through, and it's worth you all kind of taking a look at this and thinking about it as you have conversations that will touch on some of these issues again throughout the rest of today and tomorrow as well.
Could I ask one last question on industries? Did you ask directly what people thought of specific industry standards? Okay, so
well, yes and no.
Yes
Right?
and no.
do you have any indication of that?
So we asked them about their standard, the standard that they were most familiar with, and they responded that way. So the text in particular can be read with specific references to some standards, and we can take the aggregated feedback as indicative of the standards, but you have to do some parsing.
Yeah, and Lloyd, to that point, we can do that parsing, and there are some industries or sectors that suggest it might be more of an issue, but to Marvin's earlier point, within each industry or sector, we only had a few responses, so it's difficult to conclude, which is where we want to dive in deeper to understand.
And there were some cases where, as we touched on earlier, the respondent identified multiple industries that were of priority for them. So we'll have to kind of dig in deeper to see where their feedback aligned with what industry we're possible.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to look at as we triage this out. But if we have a large industry with relatively low adoption rates and relatively low participation through the various channels, that would strike me as an area where we probably should prioritize upgrading the standard.
But we may also have relatively little SAG representation in that same industry for the same reason.
Right. And so those are things that may not solve themselves, but where we want.
Great. So just to wrap up, a few key next steps for the team. The first is for us to follow up with the 22 individuals who noted at the end of the survey that they would like to have further, more in-depth conversations about their responses. That will help us get a lot more detail where we have some question marks. Many of those concerns we touched on today. Continue to identify by going through the data trends worthy of additional investigation, or even specific comments that might be very thoughtful, where we really need to say, what's going on here? Let's look at it more. So there's a lot of data to sort through, and we're still doing that. And then the final piece will be figuring out how to and continuing to host SAG engagements that will enable us to get more insights on some of the key themes that emerged from this survey. So as I mentioned, it's really just a first step for us to start to engage with the members more. And I think the survey responses have already given us enough insights to really start to say, hey, we should focus on these key themes, what SAG members are interested in them, who's willing to provide us with more feedback. Let's talk about it more.
Does Stephanie have anything to ask or add?
Thank you, Vice Chair Verdi.
Nope, no questions from me.
All right, thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, so,
All right.
Antonio, you can take us through the global gap.
Yep. Okay. Now we're getting into the global gap analysis. So everybody knows that globalization is one of the organizational goals overall. It's also a goal on the research team. But the main question, I think, the first question to ask is where we are at now, how globally applicable our standards are, and that's what we've tried. We've been going through answering by doing this project over the summer. So essentially the way the project was structured is we really tried to leverage the existing research we've done so far, specifically in categorizing metrics. Some of you might remember when we were codifying standards, we had so-called frequently occurring metrics. So we've taken upon on categorizing more and more of those metrics, applying it across all 981 metrics that we have in all 77 standards, grouping them to help us really understand the areas where global applicability might be a challenge. Then essentially we really dug deep into understanding the technical protocols and the references where we have references to third-party standards, frameworks, regulations, and so on and so forth, and also really understand in which way those regulations or frameworks are referenced, whether it's in defining certain terms through that, defining scope, or cross-referencing some calculation approach. Then essentially we really focus on assessing potential applicability of these metrics. Let's say if a company with operations outside of the US were to pick up the standard, would they be able to potentially report the metric if they find that to be a relevant topic, financially material topic, and report that metric? So I highlighted applicability here, again, to reemphasize this term and not to confuse it with financial materiality. So it's not something that we were assessing through this project. So it's still, as in our overall approach, is for a company to determine what is material, and then there could be some exceptions where topic may not necessarily apply to most companies within a certain geographic segment or specific industry. So we just approached it from the standpoint of applicability. And we assessed that using some of the largest capital markets. Specifically, we looked at Canada, EU, UK, Japan, China, Brazil, and Australia in the context of regulatory environments of those countries and regions. In the scope of each and every industry and every metric, we really try to figure out whether companies would be able to report it. And beyond that, we really took on some steps to assess what could be the next steps that the SASB could take through the project to address metrics that might not be globally applicable. So there's a certain, it was a pretty extensive work that has been done over the summer. We had a huge spreadsheet where we're categorizing, classifying this metric in certain categories. So we really try to assess whether a metric is global. That category can be thought of in two ways: global unchanged or global improved, where metric is already global applicable, yet we could make minor improvements to the technical protocol. And then on the other hand, there are going to be metrics that are not globally applicable. And within that, within that category, we could think of the potential solution as addressing it through adding more regional equivalents, or going through a more principle-based approach where metrics are more challenging and where deeper understanding of approach to measuring performance in the topic is needed.
So, a little more specificity and clarity around what we mean by globally applicable. And so, I can think of, on the one hand, we could say that, like a general approach would be to say, well, anytime there is a country-specific reference that's exclusive somewhere, that is a problem for global applicability. And that would sort of make sense, except that it is possible that a country-specific reference could actually be both useful and implementable, specific. It still could be, and the flip side is that there could be some subjectivity around this. There's certainly some subjectivity when, or at least, we might need to know, for example, that particularly underrepresented minorities, and that is more of an issue in some parts of the world than others, and in some parts of the world it's actually not legally allowable to gather information or ask about that specifically. And so that creates a global applicability issue that is, it's not as obvious simply by reading the words. So if you could just comment a little bit about the methodology for assessing global.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And actually, there are multiple points to that comment. I think, and that kind of speaks to how complex this project actually is. It's not a very straightforward way to just say, oh, this is global applicable, not applicable metric. And that's why it's more art than science, and we try to play with these categories and see which direction we can take it. But essentially, currently, the way we structure technical protocols and some metrics is we try to make them globally applicable by using so-called non-exclusive reference to defining a scope. Let's say we say the scope of disclosure includes, but it's not limited to, and we give a list of, like, let's say 5 or 10 regulations, right? And we try to already use a list of most prominent regulations across the world, right? Obviously, there might be hundreds more of those regulations, but it's just not cost effective. It would not make sense for us to develop technical protocols that span across 30 pages in a PDF format, right? So
it would create a huge redundancy issue.
Exactly.
The more that you directly reference, the more likely it is that something will be outdated quickly.
Exactly. So in those cases, when we already do not exclusively limit the disclosure to a very specific regulation, we would tag that metric as globally applicable. So the company essentially, per our understanding, of course, that's contingent on feedback that we might receive, we would assume that the company would be able to relay a relevant regulatory framework to their region of operations and report that metric and collect the data and present the data in that format. So to the later part of the comment, there could be instances where even in principle, let's say, especially that's common, you will see later in the financial sector, which is a very heavily regulated sector, and certain terminology is very U.S. specific, U.S. centric, and just approach to performance, let's say on Community Investment Act, to approach to financial inclusion could be very U.S. centric just in general, and that's how we capture metrics. And it's not as simple as just say, well, use the regional equivalent in EU to report this metric. And that's where the metric would be tagged as non-global applicable, and very likely that this metric would be captured as principle-based approach, where a little bit more research and understanding and engagement with companies would be needed to figure out a better metric or maybe an additional metric to help measure performance in the topic.
And so where we have this category of global but potential for improvement, it would an example of that be that it's a non-exclusive list of references, but that we are pointing to enough key references to be helpful with technical protocol, likely to produce, useful, comparable information.
Yes, correct. That's one example. Sometimes it could be actually maybe since the standards were codified or since the research was done on that topic, there has been a global development in the space, and there now may be a globally applicable framework that exists. So instead of even referencing regional equivalents, we might as well just reference one framework that is globally adopted and can be just used as a single framework. That could be even a better approach, potentially addressing the issue.
And so all this review work been our view of global applicability, or a view of global applicability by asking people who are in certain countries of the applicability.
It's our view, it's our own analysis.
So, which, still is good, but that might be something to think about. And then, do you believe at all that a lack of translation of our standards is part of the issue of the understanding, unless people saying it's applicable or not?
Good question. I mean, it's a great question. It was a big challenge for us to assess potential applicability of some metrics, because the data, the evidence we would try to uncover would not be available in English. So even for us to, just our lack of multilingual abilities also hinders our ability to assess in some ways.
In the translation work that I've had the experience of doing with the major languages around the world, in contracting with business people, I mean, they have tweaked our, the other frameworks, they did tweak those words a bit because they explain that no one will understand this if I translate it this way, but if I translate it this way, so that they will. So again, I think we need, I know we had that on the table. I think we should keep thinking about, and you don't solve all the issues right away, but there's a handful of languages you might put in order. The other thing too is even in English, there can be some, you could come up with the view that there's a UK version and a Canadian version of English, but I just think we should think about the translation as well.
Yeah.
And Bob, maybe just to jump onto your first point as well. This self-assessment is really our first attempt to get a sense of what we're dealing with, and then that'll really set us up well to engage in the deeper conversations around, for these types of issues, going to specific market participants to help us unpack that. This will be our first step in a long journey.
And there's a bunch of great content here, and before we maybe talk too much about what we think of all this, let's make sure that we understand all of it.
Yeah. So a few other categories where we're looking at delineating and the challenges and the next steps. So we really want to figure out whether it's a metric level issue, maybe a sub-metric. So let's say, so for everybody to be on the same page, if we say water consumed, percentage renewable, what we mean by sub-metric is percentage renewable, for example. There could be a challenge there, right? Only there. Or a technical protocol level. So essentially, it's the situation where by addressing the technical protocol, we would not have to change the title of the metric itself. And then the level of complexity, it's also a little bit more of art than science to try to, considering the time frame that we had to assess, to our best knowledge, we try to assess whether we already more or less know what change is needed, and it could be like a quick win, or whether it's like additional research is required. And to my point earlier about this principle-based approach related metrics, where it's really challenging to figure out how to measure a topic, that's where potentially more extensive research and consultation with companies would be needed. So the results, the big news is that 82% of all the metrics in our standards that out of 981 accounting metrics, 82% are global applicable currently. That includes those that are global unchanged and global improved. So 18% of total metrics, only 18% are not global applicable. So the 20% are essentially those that are global improved. So that's where they might benefit from additional research and improvement in the technical protocols mostly.
The bad news is that's still 174.
So the 174, but remember I mentioned the frequently occurring metrics categories. Leveraging that, so we have 70 of those metrics are unique, and 104 remaining metrics, they actually cut across 39 frequently occurring metric categories. So that reduces the magnitude, the extent to which the metrics are not globally applicable. And the really good news, I think, is that 91 out of 130 categories are actually already globally applicable. So that's a good sign, I think. So the next point is that
maybe open that up a little.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm not sure whether to be thrilled or challenged by that.
I think both.
That 20% that's in limbo. We're saying it's limited, but we know an easy fix, or you could live with it, but maybe it could be better. That's a big chunk to have in this twilight zone.
Well, I think some nuance on what we should think about the 20 and the other 20 essentially will come out through some of the other data. To what extent is this a topic versus a metric versus a technical protocol issue? To what extent is this sector specific or not, right? Because the more it is localized in particular areas, the more likely it is that suggests, a way to fix that. If it's opening up everything to give it 2%, then that's a different cost.
And just add on to that, we also did assess, as Anton mentioned, if there is a known solution or if there is a significant amount of research that would be required.
Which will show us.
Yes, yes. And then also I wanted to mention to the earlier Verity's point and what you just said, Jeff, about the topic level. We did try to actually also look at that as well, just at the high level to see if the topics would apply. And that kind of relates to the next slide where the finding was that the challenges on global applicability are not evenly distributed across all 11 sectors. There are a few outliers, specifically healthcare sector is number one, and the financial sector are those where we have some of the most highest number of non-global applicable metrics. And those would be also, I believe, most challenging from the standpoint.
Highly regulated, dramatically different business models.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That's exactly the reason. So that's an important point for communication.
Well, those are the second and third largest sectors in the S&P 500.
Yeah.
So,
Other than that.
I think that factors in here because there are sectors that are smaller and very nuanced and would take a tremendous amount of work. But I think you've got some pretty obvious targets.
Well, no, it's also so diverse and so complicated. You know, we'll just have to balance that. But, you know, you start thinking about healthcare across the globe.
Yeah. Well, and healthcare is always delivered locally. So it's going to be difficult to find global standards for certain.
Yeah. So digging a little bit deeper in the context of the metrics that are not globally applicable, within those we try to understand the level at which the challenge appears, whether it's the technical protocol, submetric, and metric. And you can see that the vast majority is in the technical protocol itself.
That's good news, right?
That's good news. Yes, that's good news. Those that are metric level, they are probably, I'm pretty confident that they are going to be in those two sectors. So that's another point. And I think I might as well mention it here, is that, you know, something to consider, again, thinking through the prioritization categories is the order of operations, right? So do we need to jump straight into fixing metrics when analysis of the industry structure or the topic level materiality could highlight some different issues where we might have to change the standards completely? So those, if we were to change metrics and then have to remove them, so is that even the area we should be looking at? So that's something to think about here as well. And then on the left side, the complexity level, you can see that about a half, using, of course, the caveat here is that the data is still subject to QC. We need to make sure that you know, really dig a little bit deeper, using you know, more research to understand whether it's no change to the extent we actually already know a quick fix. But for now, we think that, you know, about half of the metrics we already more or less know the track that we should be taking.
Wow, good news.
Yeah, so that's good news. I have some more slides there in an appendix. It should be in your Word book, so if you want to dig deeper. But essentially, this again, bringing back the slide with 11 categories, the project that has been done right now, it's easier to think about this as it's actually existing project that's been already basically completed, to map it back to those 11 categories. And you can see that 3 categories are highlighted here. Not only number 8, globalization, that's because essentially the project was focused on technical protocols, right, on the measurements in the standards. So that again highlights that the fact that globalization should be thought of as a thematic approach to the standards rather than as a standalone theme for projects. So from there, so we can think of the few things here. First is the, again, key points and the themes that we uncovered by doing this project. First is that the majority of the SASB metrics are globally applicable. 2 is that financials and healthcare sectors are least globally applicable, the most challenging sectors for the reasons mentioned, and that the majority of non-global metrics have relatively straightforward improvement solutions. So those are, I think, good news in a way. And
Let us know when you're done.
so what are the conclusions here, right? So first is that we think that globalization of the standards requires a multifaceted approach. So globalization cannot be achieved through a dedicated project. And as I mentioned earlier, the order of operations to be considered in updating the standards. We don't want to jump into the metrics right away if they might be removed because topics will be done.
On that second conclusion point here.
So what I mean by that is that I think that kind of like overlaps with this order of operations team as well, is that let's take financials or especially healthcare sector where a significant research is needed to really understand the differences in how industries operate across different countries. So that's where we really need to take a top-down approach in understanding the structure and focus of projects. Even let's say we're going to be assessing the human capital, and we're going to be touching on the healthcare sector partially. Globalization should be really a consideration within that human capital project focused on healthcare.
Yeah, if I could sort of think about this, I think we should think about this from two perspectives. When we say it's unlikely that a dedicated project could be used to solve this particular issue, it's both from a project management standpoint, but then also from the due process that would be required as well, because the gamut that we run in potential improvements would run from very narrow scope issues that can be solved relatively quickly to really broad ones. And if we bundle it in one project, especially when there's due process around that, then we put something all out, all before the board at a particular point in time and ask the marketplace to review, comment on what we're proposing. If it's all bundled in one project, it's going to indefinitely postpone unnecessarily some of those improvements, overburden the marketplace when it comes time to comment on it. And from a staffing perspective, it probably would be unwieldy as well. So it's just because, if I understand what the way to interpret all this, it's because of the diversity of issues and potential solutions that one project won't make sense.
But there's a subset of them that can be solved.
There may be one project we think is important enough to prioritize. There may be multiple projects that we think are important enough to prioritize. It's just that anything that we prioritize, it wouldn't be just one that would solve everything. And we can't do everything.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yes, and to the point that the last bullet here on the conclusion that there are some small updates that are feasible in the short term, so there's like small quick wins that we can
Sounds like
take.
we're shrinking our expectations down dramatically here. I was very excited a few minutes ago. There should be a significant subset that are targeted, as you showed, with little work and little research that aren't cross-cutting issues that can dramatically improve our global relevance without compromising some of the broader issues. Now you're saying we're down to a very small subset of that. I'm not sure where the balance is.
Well, go to the last bullet.
So the next step for us first is that, of course, we need to just to check the quality of data, although we are pretty confident that the results are unlikely to change much. And then we are going to be designing projects to address this low-hanging fruit. And the third point, I think that's where it speaks to what Jeff was saying, but also in the context of that it's unlikely that it's going to be globalization as a primary focus of a project that addresses certain metrics. It might be bundled as a project addressing a topic or a thematic issue where globalization will be on the back of our mind, and we might capture 50 out of those 174 metrics by working on a thematic project. So that's, I think, where the way we are thinking about this right now.
But is there one way to think about this as well? So when we're thinking about what to prioritize, it sounds like, I mean, globalization is a way to think about that, but the breakdown that you had earlier, where we were talking about, an improvement versus a change being needed, and if there's a change, metric versus technical protocol or complexity, like these are ways in which we could think about what to try to address. And that, on the one hand, I suspect that complex issues, things that where there's a complex solution are likely to be important but challenging. And ones where there's no straightforward solution may be easy to solve, but not necessarily as important as the other ones. So we have to factor both of those things into the decision making. But it sounds like that's a helpful way to think beyond just the question of how much do we want to prioritize for.
Right, and I think that's why we didn't want to kind of drive your decisions right now based on this presentation and this section on the global gap analysis alone. It's more, the next one will focus on the materiality map review, for example, and that information mix as a whole will then inform your decisions, and I think Brian will have a section.
Kurt's expressed excitement on application guidance, global applicability, so we're watching you, Kurt. You only have so many points to use on security for you. Yeah, true, good point.
Let me ask, actually, because I just thought this was so fruitful. Thank you. I mean, really, this is an area that I don't think was well understood. You brought a lot of light just from the preliminary project. This number, 82% appear globally applicable. Two questions. Do you think that's a number that upon further review might change a lot, or do you feel like there's some pretty good central tendency on that? And second, is that a number that you think it would be sensible for us to manage to over time? Should we say, look, it's 82 now, and we'd like to get to 100 and make that part of the overall management of this process?
Yeah, so I don't think personally that the number will change much. Through
the quality control.
Through the quality control.
I'm worried about the other 20, the credibility-wise. Until we have a better handle on what got to the 82 and then what was that other 20%, I'd be hesitant, publicly at least, to say that, you've got this gray zone. Additional 20%, and it's hard for me to know if those are the vast majority are relevant, or if there's significant gaps in that other bucket that would be risky.
That's just kind of, I haven't dug into, delineation there that much yet, but I would actually think that probably more, there might be more metrics in the 62% that might not be actually globally applicable than those that are in the 20. Simply because the 20 category is probably more likely to actually be globally applicable, because those are metrics that are likely to already reference regional equivalents, but we can go a step further referencing more. What that indicates is that we're already taking an approach defining them in the context of global applicability. There could be, though, metrics in the 62% that are currently tagged as global unchanged by further understanding the references, which might not be actually single reference to global framework, which may, by digging deeper into it, we might actually realize that the metric is not global applicable. So I would be less worried about the 20%, but more thinking about into that 62.
And on the pie chart that showed that in terms of level of change, 3/4 of them were technical protocol level, more or less like the other quarter were thinking of the metric level. And we saw that there was some clustering within sector. So is the sense that the metric level issues are more likely to be clustering in particular sectors? Is this financial and healthcare, maybe infrastructure or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. There are going to be a few utilities industries are the other example where it's a very regulatory driven. A few challenging metrics in the extractive, but that's definitely the case. Yeah.
That to me is to the extent that it's metric level and located in a particular industry. If there were known solutions or feasible solutions, I think that's I mean, that would elevate a lot, you know, a specific sort of project on that.
Mhm.
If it is,
Yeah.
it is like, you know, extensive research because we are really not sure what to do, and it starts to spread across multiple different sectors, then it's very difficult to navigate that, you know, in any one project, and having a bunch of different things that are like narrow and super challenging doesn't seem like a great use of time. So that's partly how I would think about it. And then if it's, you know, the technical protocol issues, if they're sweep quick, again, that's different for me than if, you know, it's not clear what would improve it and it's pervasive throughout.
Yeah, yeah. I just on a personal note, I would just add that in developing the SASB standards for 6 years, I think top-down versus bottom-up approach when we were taking either or, I think it's always top-down that kind of really helps us drive through the standards update and thinking kind of like it might be a little bit myopic to jump into certain technical protocols to start taking this bottom-up approach to such a issue as global applicability.
Well, it would be helpful if, you know, to have a little more insight into the location of the metrics, you know, for us to kind of think about.
Yeah. Do you want to look into the appendix slides? There are some.
Or, you know, we can potentially talk about that. You can just point us to that like offline.
Sure.
That's okay.
Absolutely.
And we were gonna stop for a break, but before we do, I want to make sure that we have more time just before we wrap up this topic. So, yeah. Last questions on global gap analysis.
I'll make just a quick comment since I've been using up all the air in the room. I do think this is great new information, by the way, and it's great for us to start to get our arms around the scope of where the gaps are, where the strengths are, and all that. So we're definitely confused on a higher level.
Well, I think, you know, you mapped out the magnitude of the challenge and you mapped out a triage process, so, that looks really promising.
I would just also add on or advocate that tremendous amount of nuance here, tremendous amount of applicability, a lot of work to be done through a lot of different channels and approaches. Where it fits in on prioritization, we'll get to that more and more. Taking a step back from all of that and at a high level, looking at that 82% data point to me is really, really encouraging, even acknowledging the caveats and the complexities behind that. We still unfortunately hear comments out in the marketplace around how the standards are entirely U.S.-centric or the standards aren't applicable outside of the U.S. And I think starting to bring some data and some real analysis into that discussion and have the board be aware of some of these preliminary data points and staff and other parts of the organization and the greater SASB network and advisory groups and SASB reporters and so forth. I think that this is overall positive. It's overall very, very good news at the highest level. More work to be done, without a doubt, but very, very reaffirming of, generally speaking, the SASB standards are globally applicable.
Ryan, you know, I'm breaking my own promise, I guess. It would be great to categorize some of these, you know, take some examples from the range of issues and, you know, what are a couple areas that, you know, it's clear, what are some where there's minor gaps. So I think if we could give a few case studies or not case studies, just examples, it would help us in communication, acknowledging where there may be a gap because there's a new metric or it's not relevant here. But I think there's a lot of, this is fertile field here, and it'd be great to mine it a little bit for the takeaways so we all have a little bit of perspective on it.
Absolutely. Good comment. Agree.
Great. So this was very, very informative. Appreciate all the work that the team did in pulling together the materials for this first set of sessions. We're going to be coming back to discuss two more topics on materiality map consistency review and also the work that's been done as part of the corporate reporting dialogue and our involvement there. So we are going to take a 20-minute break and we will come back at 2:50 Eastern time. We're not going to drop the call, so we're just going to go to mute on that. So feel free to stay dialed in or dial back in later on. We'll pick up in 20 minutes. Great, welcome back, everybody. We are back for the second half of our board meeting today. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be available afterward on our website. And also, as a reminder, the materials for today and tomorrow are available also on our website. So to SASB.org to our calendar tab under the standard setting board, and you'll see the agenda items for today and materials for that. And if there is any comments or feedback on today's discussion, as well as discussion, we welcome that as well. Please send us your. So we are now going to be diving into what we have learned from looking at our materiality map and doing a consistency review there, and then we will jump into feedback from the work that we are doing as part of the corporate reporting dialogue. So go ahead and start with the materiality map consistency review, and for that we're going to turn to Anton.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, me again. We've been discussing different channels of the input to help the board inform their prioritization categories. So we're going to be talking about one input that is generated from the research team as a staff input on prioritization, specifically the review that we've done of the materiality map. Specifically, the focus here are industries, the structure, general issue categories, essentially, or taxonomies, the 26 general issue categories across 5 pillars, and all 444 topics that are currently included in the standards. So what's going to be shown on this slide, just for the sake of everybody, it's just illustrative. Whenever something is highlighted, doesn't mean that we're indicating the specific project is needed for that industry or a topic or anything like that. Just a note. So we've done this research. I'm going to speak to this in the context of the 5 broad categories of review. So the first category is the scope of general issue categories. And there are a few things there. So first is we look through the cross-sector applicability of the scope of the general issue categories. Sometimes there might be challenges where the scope of a GIC would be very limited. One example would be systemic risk management, which is currently, although it does not only appear in the financial sector, it largely is drafted around the financial sector issues related to systemic risk. Where we could look outside of that scope is by looking at the issues related to the critical infrastructure industry, where you can also think about the issues associated with big systemic issues, and we might potentially look into including additional topics within that category. Additionally, in the scope of this category, we can think of issues related to the delineation of ESG sustainability versus business sustainability. So this is a very nuanced and conceptual angle we need to consider, where, for example, running a large, highly leveraged firm, it's not sustainable from a financial standpoint, but it may not necessarily be not sustainable from an ESG standpoint. Or similarly, like industries or companies like Blockbuster running out of business for inability to catch up with innovation, where industry is going, may not always be related to sustainability, to the ESG sustainability of it. And the other example could be here related to the emerging issues rising in their level of importance in certain sectors, and specifically the category here would be management of legal and regulatory environment. And the topic that can come up often is the customer privacy. So we could potentially look at the angle of management of regulatory environment in the context of customer privacy as it's looking into the scope of that category. So the next category of issues that we look through is this industry standard or structure of industries. So essentially industry homogeneity and heterogeneity, how ESG categories are addressed within each. So good example is actually in the sector that I cover, financials, where we have currently consumer finance industry and commercial banks industry. And currently commercial banks industry kind of captures both retail banking and corporate banking, where environmental social externalities created by companies operating in, if distinct, could be very, very different, while retail banking can really overlap with that of consumer finance. So we might consider regrouping those two industries into more retail and consumer finance versus corporate banking. So that's one consideration. And of course, global landscape is something that we need to consider in the structuring of industries and potentially creating new industries or splitting industries. One example will be discussed tomorrow by Taylor, where we could look into the scope of the apparel industry in the context of manufacturing versus branding.
Let me ask you a question. Everything you say makes sense, but I'm not sure why that's specific to materiality.
Oh, so
Maybe let me ask the same question in a different way. Is this conversation about the map? Or
About what
the
we learned from
or the industry?
the map needed some of the time and focus of the research team, and we've learned some from that. So this is a source of input to our prioritization because of the work that is being done on the materiality.
Just think of it as the name of the project.
Yeah.
That we call it. We call it the Materiality Map Consistency Review because the Materiality Map rolls up all these different elements, general issue categories, sector, industry, topic, metric. It rolls them all up. So
The whole
it's not the product or visualization.
Yeah.
It's just the name of it's a consistency analysis, and it's the name of the project. That's
Reviewing the standards through the
through the way.
exactly.
perspective of materiality.
Well,
Yeah.
there's also this other, we have names for topics, we have names for metrics, but this is a different set of names for general issue categories, and we're learning, we have to make sure they're about sustainability,
Mhm.
stick to our knitting, we're not determining going concerns or not,
Mhm.
credit rating agencies. And we have to, make sure that they are capturing all the latest and greatest issues that people care about and report on, but also that they can actually apply to many sectors and not just a single sector.
Yes, exactly right. Yep. So the next category is the materiality threshold. So that's one where we might want to essentially in applying SASB's conceptual framework and approach to materiality, having evidence of financial impact and evidence of investor interest, we really want to ensure that we are consistent in terms of the threshold to ensure that the topic is in fact financial material and should be included. And there are certain topics across standards where we might need to reevaluate our approach, specifically more in the area of environment as a pillar. We might have some topics, for example, related to energy management, where energy as an expense represents only about 2% of the cost of goods sold, which would also include in that expense rent, which might be kind of indicative of potential not a significant cost, therefore may not necessarily be something the company should manage from the standpoint of financial materiality. And on the other hand, there's also a potential topic category. So this is the area where we might have, potential gaps in and opportunities to explore inclusion of new topics. So for that, we've done some high-level evidence research where already some evidence might be resurfaced, indicating companies being impacted financially. Also, we look through kind of like industry characteristics. One example here is, let's say, in the insurance industry that is under financial sector, which includes P&C and life, we have a topic related to transparent information, fair advice. It's pretty similar in how healthcare industry operates in that context. Yet we do not have transparent information, fair advice topic in the healthcare sector. So, and there are a few examples like that where industry characteristics would indicate the potential inclusion of a topic. In many cases, that is prevalent in the leadership and governance related to the specifically business ethics category. And the last, the fifth category of review that we've looked at is the topic scope. So this one is pretty broad. When the first one, when the one on the materiality threshold could be potentially leading to removal of a topic, the potential topic could potentially lead to inclusion of a topic. The topic scope could lead to both of those. Also, it could lead to merge of two topics, split of topics, or restructuring the topic, or even remapping the topic into different general issue category. So there are a few themes there. So it could be in the context of a general issue category. We have sometimes topics that are in their essence are about product quality and safety, yet measurements that are used for that or approach to management could be around supply chain, and those would be captured kind of like drafted as supply chain issues, when in that case it's not really necessarily a good fit to the supply chain general issue category, which is about environmental and social externalities of suppliers. So we might need to rethink how that topic is structured. So that's one piece. And the second piece of it could be actual emerging themes. And some of those are use of plastics and opioid crisis in the healthcare sector specifically, where we already do have some topics that capture other angles of issues like, you know, customer welfare, protocols, and safety, but some of the emerging trends may not be fully addressed in the scope of those topics, or through the metrics, or just in the discussion of the topic, and then maybe in technical protocol. So that's the last category. So this slide shows a high-level summary of the findings. It's so far been done over 5 sectors. So the themes here is that, which is a little bit surprising as we've gone into it. Maybe we thought that we were going to probably identify some of the topics that need more research in terms of materiality threshold, but we actually identified that there are more potentially missing topics than existing topics that merit further investigation and evidence research. And specifically, those potential topics are predominantly in the governance dimension, and topics that need that research would probably be more in the environment dimension. Another interesting point, and I think that kind of, you know, if we recall our, you know, loved basis for conclusions and updates to the standards we've gone through in the codification, you could remember that like financial sector, healthcare sector, those stood out as like most changes we had to go through because of our staggered approach to provisional standards development. We had to really catch up with some of those sectors and make more updates. Reviewing these 5 sectors that were kind of representative from going back to provisional to the latest sectors like infrastructure to the earliest healthcare financials. Right now, the distribution of those topics we identified through this project is pretty evenly distributed among those sectors. So that's an interesting point. And then the last theme here is that the scope related issues are actually predominantly in the social capital and the business model dimension, and that kind of speaks to the fact that like those dimensions are the most challenging in the context of even like scoping the general issue categories.
Could you talk to the governance dimension there for a little bit? Because I know, you know, when people hear governance, they think one thing, and so I'm wondering whether I should be thinking of it that way or the way that we've thought about it in the context of our standards, so not necessarily the traditional corporate governance perspective, but more specifically around environmental governance, environmental and social issues.
Totally. No, totally. Absolutely. I think that's specifically when we think about the governance and meaning leadership, we call it leadership and governance dimension. Within that dimension, we address such issues as business ethics, competitive behavior, management of legal and regulatory environments. The way we, and if you go to the materiality map on our website, you will be able to see the scope descriptions of each of those categories. They will always be drafted in the context of management of environmental and social risks of companies. So failure to have a governance control may expose a company to risks that are associated with social or actual environmental issues. So it's not necessarily in the traditional context of governance, as ESG frameworks may address board diversity and independence and things like that. So it's really more about what we currently have in our taxonomy. It's not that we need to rethink really governance approach. It's more about how we are applying that approach across all 77 industries, or potentially more industries.
So not to argue that, but what that does is we've moved to this ESG reporting, 3 letters, environmental, social, and governance. People are looking for standards that companies report related to those things to integrate that into their investment decision-making process. Clearly, we have things related to environmental, water issues, all those things, social, the workforce, child labor, all those things. But a discussion I have with some people is we're missing the G.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe we debate this another time, but we are missing the G. We've looked at G as, well, G is the governance of the E and the S, or something like that. And I think that's kind of a cop-out. So I think one thing I'd like to have us think about someday is, do we address the G? And my view of addressing the G is the most already well-developed aspect of what companies are already reporting. There's all these requirements about board composition, board resumes, number of meetings, committee charters, all that stuff. So I felt that a quick fix, and remember, we've always said, if there's already something that existed, we don't want to make up something new. So I guess in terms of priorities, I think we should think about, are we going to keep the G as is, or are we going to really address the G? And one way we could address the G is, and maybe back to Steve's comments, would one of the firms be willing to do an analysis of what are all the G items that actually currently exist there, and could we sort of summarize them and then just slip them into our standards or consider that supplemental guide? So that, no comment on that. But if you go back to your materiality map, so I see what you're doing, and so should we change all this stuff? But you never addressed the left-hand side starts with the 6 capitals.
Mm-hmm.
And my view of the materiality map is, so what you're saying is let's not make all these changes, but I think we anchored the materiality map on the 6 capitals, which seemed to be something someone else came out, right? These are the 6 capitals. So I'm suggesting that, so if you got to change all the materiality map, you might need to have to abandon the 6 capitals. I also looked at the materiality map as the end out, after you did all your standards, you then created the materiality map to tell you how it maps. So I was just wondering if we should start with the materiality map, where the materiality map just ends up getting created when you complete the standards.
So let me see if I can touch on a couple of those points. On governance, I think we have thought a lot about the role of the incremental values we can have in traditional corporate governance topics, and one way we could think about that is exactly as you mentioned, and that's a potential thing we could prioritize going forward. Another way that we could also think about it is we are going to talk tomorrow more specifically around the conceptual framework, which we know needs to be addressed, and that is a place for us to also articulate our vision of where there is value in addressing some governance topics and how we think about the importance of other governance topics and making it clear where we endorse good governance versus set standards around good governance. So I think the board should consider what strategy makes the most sense for helping make sure that people understand what's important and that they can turn to SASB as a trusted standard setter. I think that the key point with this is in thinking about the materiality map, which is a very useful tool for a lot of folks out there that look to us. As we try to keep it useful because of changes that have been made, what are we learning about potential opportunities to improve the standards? And at least in thinking about it through the lens of it being a tool that gets used externally. We have thought about ways in which it could be used as a communication tool to help our stakeholders who want to report against multiple frameworks, for example, to think about how our standards map to other frameworks. So like there are the 6 capitals under integrated reporting, for example. We have generally bucketed as a communication device our general issue categories into 5 buckets that aren't exactly the same. And again, that's a helpful thing for the organization to think about in terms of communicating the value of what we do, whether we can make it easier for people to see the connections across multiple frameworks. And we'll also talk about the Better Alignment Project in a little bit, and so that's helpful there. But that was just a couple comments on that. Again, the point being that we do want to think about how this is helpful for thinking about issues that we might want to prioritize.
Yeah, I guess, just 2 comments. And first, I have reservations, I guess I would say, about us getting into governance in its more general, traditional sense, in a way that would work across public and private companies operating under different legal regimes, and whether we're really adding much value in doing that. And like the approach which sticks to governance as it relates to sustainability, I guess maybe that's just using E&S over as a terminology. But that's all maybe a much bigger discussion than I have at the moment. My other reaction on this is and this is all great information, I have a little trouble understanding how it would be reduced to specific projects or work. And would that be on an industry by industry basis or a sector basis or across general issues categories? I'm having trouble seeing what we do with this.
Yeah, I mean, so right now it's just for discussion, no decision expected here. But as you can see, those numbers, they add up to 80, right? There could be 80 individual projects. There could be some of them could be mapped because they're more general issue category related. So, that's something to consider. And plus, there are 6 more sectors to do analysis.
Since it seems like it can't be 80 projects, maybe it would be a healthcare related.
Yeah.
Here's what I would say, Dan, is that as we know, the first phase of standards development was bottoms up, sector by sector. Codification took more of a simultaneous approach, but really neither of those first 2 phases enabled us to take a big step back and do a high level systematic analysis of things like how consistently are we applying general issue categories. That's what this project was meant to make some headway in, connecting it into the project management model or concept, not in any way whatsoever meant to directly translate it. So I think the shortest answer, Anton, jump in if you disagree, or David, this information has no bearing whatsoever on how we would actually tackle these issues. It's meant to just give us some information on, do we think it's more about issues in the standards now that really need further investigation, or do we think that it's more about an opportunity for potentially missed topics in other spaces,
That's a relief, because this seems to suggest stopping the training for a couple of years and in a way redoing the codification project to enforce.
And I don't think that's in any way not in any way what we want to indicate. We just really want to challenge our own thinking. These aren't necessarily even any conclusions. These are very, very preliminary indicators that really constantly challenging our own thinking and how systematically were we applying that materiality threshold of this one general issue category across 77 industries. Can we unsurface any information that might give staff a little bit of something to run with? So, an indicator to then use to go out and meet with some companies and investors, conduct some more research, and then potentially come forward with some views on, or maybe it's a dead end. So I
want to chime in here.
Yeah, please.
Because the materiality map is something that's very widely loved and adopted in the investor community, and there was that earlier chart about familiarity with technical protocols, and the investors had lower familiarity with the technical protocol. And I would guess that one reason for that is they go to the materiality map, which doesn't necessarily link to a technical protocol. They stay at the topic and metric level, which this enables. Very useful. But then, a generalist or a portfolio manager could look across the materiality map and then say, well, it doesn't make sense. It's missing for this sector that I know really well. It's not hitting a dark red box where I think it is a material issue. I think that's how we could use this, potentially surface specific topics that could be added. So I'm thinking about the materiality project that's feeding into 2 of these into categories. One could be the thematic issue materiality, where you're thinking about what are the general issues as being applicable across more sectors, or then, you know, seeing a gap and saying there should be a direct topic for a particular sector.
Yeah, I want to also add on what you said, Verity, and what Jeff mentioned earlier, that materiality map, on one hand, it's a communications tool, and then, but the way we looked at it here is more of a, from the standard setting standpoint, because on the communication side, it's not a standard setting related project. And, you know, just an FYI, we have a few projects in the pipeline, non-standards related to make materiality map a better communications tool. And some of it could be related to mapping 5 capitals to E, S, and G, or then going down as well, you know, communicating to foundations and other stakeholders. But we really want to focus your attention on these 11 categories and how this project relates to those and how it can be mapped to those. And again, governance documents here is highlighted from the standpoint of the importance of, you know, I think of the 26 general issue categories is something that really underpins our fundamental approach to ESG sustainability. And clarity on that is extremely important. That's something we potentially lacking a little bit in the existing conceptual framework, not fully communicating, and that maybe relates to some questions that we're getting. And so
just make sure I'm understanding there. So one possibility, because it can come up tomorrow, we'll talk about the conceptual framework project, but one possibility for a project like that could be whether or not to include aspects of like our essentially like our taxonomy, which starts effectively with the general issue category.
Yes.
And just articulating what they are, making sure that we are happy with what they are, but also we're describing in a way that is clear both for those who want to interpret what we're doing and for us as we go forward and do our work, that we're also thinking about those issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I agree with that. There's another takeaway, though, that sort of gets to kind of what Brian was hinting at, which is that this gives us the ability for the first time after building all this up from the bottom up to now look at it from top down. But it shows, at least one takeaway to me, is that everything's interconnected.
Sure.
Right? And so to the extent you start thinking about prioritizing different changes, even if you think it at the start it's just going to hit an industry, this gives me pause to say, well, what are the unintended consequences if I hit this industry standard? Do I potentially need to think that there's a connection to other industries that I wasn't necessarily thinking about, but it could impact and maybe should impact there too. And this sort of potentially shows that there are things where we were thinking about a particular industry, but sort of put a nice big dark box there, and now we're looking at it and go, that box probably could have applied here too, and here too, and here too.
Yeah.
So it's just,
I mean, that's a little bit what we did with cross-cutting issues.
Yes.
When we started to realize we independently solve these issues.
In one side.
Consistent. So that was a move for consistency anyway.
well, I do think this is one, I forget the legal term, stare decisis, where you pay attention to what you decided the last time, right? So there is a body of work here. There's a regulated body of decisions that were made. And so I do think we have to be a little careful about making a willy-nilly to make the chart work better. I agree that top-down is by far the most efficient way to inspect it, look for opportunities to improve. But certainly when we were ratifying or working on the final version of the standards, we would run into these collisions between a consistent cross-cutting issue and a very particularized industry-level standard. And often those were uncomfortable choices because you want a worse standard that fits well with everything else or a better standard that fits this industry.
That's our job, is to make that call, actually. That is exactly it.
And also to add, you know, it's not the first time. It is really the first time where we had a chance to do that as much. But if you recall, during the codification, we actually did update the taxonomy, right? We used to have 30 and moved to 26. And as we were doing that, we were making standards-related updates as well. And that went through the codification. And that's why right now, it actually looks much better than it used to. So thankfully, through the codification process, we addressed the vast majority of those issues. Now we're just taking another fresh look through the new lens and uncovering these. And this is, again, just the first initial sense. But we had already experience in going through the codification process and addressing some of these materiality map related issues.
We have about an hour left, a little less than an hour left for the rest of our meeting, and we've got one more topic to go through. We are also going to try to leave a little time so we can, just synthesize some of the thoughts from today, not having to, again, make specific decisions, but if you've got questions, you heard something in one session and something else in another session, and try to reconcile that, or if you want to dive back into some particular things before we go into the issues for tomorrow, we'll have a little bit of time for that. So, if it makes sense, maybe we'll then jump to the corporate reporting dialogue work that David Farmer's been a big part of.
Perfect. Save the best for last. So we're going to chat about the corporate reporting dialogue as one other input for you all to consider in terms of how we think about prioritization of the various areas of work that we can take on going forward. So this presentation, I'm going to try to accomplish three things. Number one, level set on what the CRD corporate reporting dialogue is. Second, what the Better Alignment Project, which was undertaken by members of the CRD, was and what its scope consisted of. And then third, based on our participation in that project, what are some takeaways for all of us to consider that can inform the prioritization of our forward work. So I'll try to hit on all three of those as efficiently as possible and leave plenty of time for discussion, as you mentioned, Jeff. So first and foremost, what is the corporate reporting dialogue, or CRD? It's really just a platform bringing together different corporate reporting frameworks that is intended to help kind of steward and coordinate efforts between the different organizations. And the purpose, as it says here, is to just strengthen cooperation, coordination, and alignment between these key standard setters and framework developers. I won't go into all the aims in detail. They really all support that stated purpose. But important to note who the participating organizations are in the corporate reporting dialogue, which you see here is CDP, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, GRI, ISO, Integrated Reporting, ourselves, of course, IFRS, and then SASB as an observing member. And then the Better Alignment Project was a project that was launched by the CRD a little over a year ago. And it has a 2-year scope, and it's really focused on, as it states here, driving better alignment in the corporate reporting landscape, to make it easier for companies to prepare effective and coherent disclosures that meet the needs of capital markets and society. So very much aligned with our mission. And participating in the project were a subset of those organizations that I mentioned to you, particularly CDP, CDSB, GRI, IIRC, and SASB. There's going to be a lot of acronyms in this presentation, so bear with me.
That's the only way you're going to be able to get through it quickly.
That's right. The scope was really for all of us to map our standards and frameworks to identify where they were common and where they were different. And then, as it stated, trying to work towards improving areas where there are overlaps to achieve better alignment, but also being very aware of the fact that the frameworks have different audiences in some cases, different focuses, different governance procedures, and sort of respecting the independence of the organization in fulfilling their stated purpose as well. So there was 2 phases to this project. Phase 1 was the first year, which is just wrapping up now, and that was taking all of our frameworks and mapping elements of each of the project participating frameworks to the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. And the initial results from that are due to be published in the very near future, this quarter. And then beyond that, there'll be a phase 2, which will extend the work beyond that initial mapping to the TCFD. But the TCFD really provided a helpful external framework to frame how we can all map our frameworks to one another, because clearly there's a million different ways you could slice that. The TCFD gave us kind of a external framework which we could map ourselves to enable us to compare ourselves to one another. So for more information, I've included the link here for those that are dialed in or for folks on the board if you want to dive into more details on the scope of that project. But maybe I'll pause and see if there's any questions on that before jumping into unpacking a little bit what the project was and then getting into some of the findings.
How's that different than the work we released in the summer as far as aligning status with the TCFD?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's very similar. We're kind of that work was in the line of trying to support the overall movement towards enhanced alignment where possible. For that particular work, we wanted to dive into a very deep dive of the SASB framework from a technical perspective and show how that could be used as an implementation tool for the TCFD. This project is more about understanding all the participating frameworks, where we're the same and where we're different and why, as a platform for considering future alignment. So it wasn't so much about focusing on how can we implement TCFD using all these tools. It was a way for us to understand where we're the same and different with the TCFD as a framing device for that.
And the tool part was in partnership with CDSB, but only with CDSB.
Exactly, that as well. It's a good point. Okay, so
Actually, you might comment on this a little bit. Phase 2 is that everyone mapping to TCFD in phase 1 is a much more limited scope project than the potential to everybody map to everybody else is. There are a lot more nodes there to connect.
Definitely, this is a very limited view, and what we're going to do in phase 2 is kind of being determined right now in terms of what is the highest value add for the market based on what we've learned from phase 1. So as I said, phase 1, we all mapped all the participants of the Better Alignment Project mapped elements of their frameworks to the TCFD's recommendations. This is a quick reminder that consists of their 7 fundamental principles for effective disclosure. So we mapped elements of our framework to that. There are 11 recommended disclosures, and then there are 50 illustrative example metrics, which are in the TCFD implementation annex. So that was the framing to which we all mapped elements of our and other participants, their reporting framework to the TCFD. And I'll mention the project also included a stakeholder survey, as well as several stakeholder roundtables. SASB hosted one in San Francisco, and all the other organizations hosted them globally. So there was an element of market feedback that was included in the project as well, and will show up in the final report. So just to give the board a sense of how we mapped our documents to various aspects of the TCFD's framework, that's demonstrated here in that our conceptual framework clearly defines our principles for standard setting, and that maps fairly directly to the TCFD's principles for effective disclosure. We'll unpack a little bit where there were some differences there that we can consider as a potential input for future work. Our application guidance includes some aspects of guidance that are included in the TCFD's principles, like things around timeliness and clarity of reported data, but it also directly maps to the TCFD's disclosures themselves, and that our application guidance includes information like you should disclose your governance of these issues, your strategy to manage them, your risk management process, and that, of course, directly maps to the TCFD's recommended disclosures. And then probably most significantly, our standards themselves both map to the principles in terms of the introductory information in the standard, which includes general principles, as well as, of course, the metrics that are specific disclosure metrics and map very well to the TCFD illustrative example metrics. So that's how our documents map generally to the TCFD's documents.
This matrix, like the materiality map, can be expanded to greater levels of detail.
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm wondering, I assume that the work that was done was much deeper than what's represented here, and that what's going to be included in this report is this or something of a finer degree of detail, but probably not, the underlying, work product that was created to try to address it. So could you just comment a little bit on that?
You nailed it exactly. So the underlying work was us going line by line in each of these documents and mapping it line by line to each of the TCFD's disclosure elements. What will be surfaced in the report are more kind of some details, but higher level takeaways in terms of things that were learned or observations related to that mapping. The metrics mapping will be included in more detail, where you'll be able to really see, what is GRI map, what is CDP map, and what did we map, to give you some idea of what are the similar metrics related to certain TCFD illustrative example metrics.
And then one more follow-up question. On the report will include the level of detail for all of the organizations that participated. To what extent did other organizations comment on the mapping? Was this just a self-report for everybody? and the underlying work product stayed essentially at the level of the organization, other than what was going to be written into the report?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was actually really fortunate that it was a highly collaborative effort. So for the most part, so for the principles and the disclosures, all 5 organizations participated. For the illustrative example metrics, it was ourselves, GRI, and CDP, since we're the ones that kind of have the reporting metrics. And that was a highly collaborative approach. So we would each iterate through mapping our framework, have long discussions around what made the most sense and what would be most helpful for an external audience. So that's where we were able to actually learn a lot from that experience that could be useful to us and to those organizations as we think about what might we do to align and where might it be beneficial to do so.
Okay.
So really collaborative, in-depth discussions. And so shout out to anyone from GRI or CDP that's listening. It was a lot of hard work, but I think a lot of benefit that came from it. So just to provide a quick cartoon of what this looked like, I think I've already said it, but might as well just show it in an image really quickly, is again, each of our organizations participating in the Better Alignment Project map aspects of each of our frameworks and or standards to the TCFD, and then from there, we were able to compare to one another. That's really important because we did not map directly to one another. We first mapped what we felt was most applicable or directly related to aspects of the TCFD, and then compared that to one another. So that the results would have been slightly different, likely, if we had just directly mapped to one another. We use the TCFD as a translation device. So that's helpful in that it gives you a framing device that is, a widely supported in the market reporting framework. But there were some slight nuances in that we were using the TCFD to sort of translate what aspects of our framework were most applicable. Overall, I think the results are still very informative and useful, but there was some trickiness to doing it in that way. So one thing I just want to touch on really quickly is that alignment is very much baked into what we do here at SASB. It's throughout our conceptual framework. So this was a really kind of a natural project for us to do. I can remember many interactions with the board where Elizabeth, you may have asked me, or Verity, how does this align with what's already being disclosed? So this is very much built into the way that we do our work. So I just wanted to highlight that and remind ourselves that alignment really is built into SASB's DNA. So this was a very natural project for us to dive into. But it's an aspect of what we consider that is also balanced with other considerations that we have in developing our standards, which of course include the usefulness of information to company and investors, our specific stakeholder audiences for which we're designing our standards, the applicability of metrics on an industry-specific basis, ensuring that we're representative in performance, and then maintaining our industry specificity. So really, alignment is critical, but it's one thing we balance against a lot of factors when making decisions as it relates to the content and standards. Okay, so that's who the CRD is, what the Better Alignment Project was, and sort of the details of how we executed it. But here are some of the takeaways. So one thing that was learned through both our participation from a technical perspective and in dialogue with other organizations, as well as some of the market feedback, was that there would be additional clarity, or additional clarity would be helpful regarding the purpose and use of each framework, and helping reporters better understand what the right tool for the job is with respect to accomplishing their reporting objectives. There was a lot of confusion around, do I do SASB and or SASB or do these things work together, or are they mutually exclusive? And that was pretty loud and clear. And so some things for us to consider are how can we be helpful, given that was a signal that we received as doing this work, in terms of potential implementation guidance we could provide, helping clarify these different tools and what they're used for, or other guidance, standalone publications that we could produce. So I think one way to think about this that I like to think about is really thinking of the different frameworks that are available as a set of tools that are available to companies to accomplish their reporting objectives, and specifically those objectives being providing certain stakeholder groups with the information they need to make decisions. So consumers might want to know if a product is organic when they're making a purchasing decision. Investors may want to know how a company is performing on a financially material factor when making an investment decision. So the different frameworks are designed to support specific stakeholders in making specific decisions. And so one way
kind of our understanding, and SASB has the advantage of being very targeted and focused on our users. Some of these other indices are much broader. So was there any discussion or debate about that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's kind of the whole point, is helping the market helping enhance market understanding of why a broadly applicable reporting framework is very useful for reaching certain stakeholder audiences and providing the information they need to make the decisions they're trying to make. And where SASB can be particularly helpful for companies who are trying to speak to investors as their primary audience.
Almost envisioning a relevance matrix.
Right. Yeah.
Which, we may be dark red for investors, and somebody else may be just, lighter color or something, that there's different levels. It's not just a yes or no.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's where there's the potential for us to be very helpful in providing that level of clarity, so that it's not that there's, I think of it as a toolkit, which is why I put this diagram up there. Different tools are helpful for achieving different objectives. And so being very clear about what are the right tools for a company seeking to accomplish a given objective, how can they use them together to most efficiently and effectively communicate or accomplish their communication goals.
I think that's an interesting concept, and one in which I think, since we were so kind of application focused in the history of SASB, that we have probably that's more inherent in our DNA perhaps than the other measures.
It should be mentioned, however, that TCFD is also intended for an investor audience.
Yes, and that's a good point. And that was sort of baked into the way we did our analysis, and that is a financial materiality focused framework. That did inform the results.
So, but if I take away the right conclusions from this slide, the Federal Alignment Project Phase 1 is going to shortly produce a report that would be somewhat helpful in helping the market to see what's in the toolkit for TCFD implementation.
Correct.
And it might be that there are 3 hammers and a saw or something like that. That's essentially what, but all of which can be useful to some degree in TCFD implementation. And you're suggesting that there may be additional work, and we'll come to standard setting questions in a bit, but additional work that SASB could do, not necessarily standard setting work, probably research team work, to provide additional guidance on how, not just around TCFD, but in a sense, like doing a bit more than just the landscape map that CRD has right now, to really kind of articulate how we fit together.
Yeah, I think it's a fair characterization, and we can draw some I think, informative and useful generalizations from the exercise that was confined to the scope of the TCFD around how we can do that more efficiently. Most of this takeaway is non-standard setting related, but research team related. However, some of the other findings are much more squarely in the standard setting realm. So to jump into the 3 different areas where we did the mapping, the principles first, one thing that was an interesting finding specifically, well, I'll start with the general finding, was that generally we're all quite aligned in terms of reporting principles. This isn't too surprising, I think, given sort of principles for accounting for information are generally well established and well understood. Jeff, you can tell me I'm wrong on that, but that was the general view.
Conceptual frameworks tend to have a degree of similarities.
Yes. Yes, we're standing on the shoulders of giants there. So I think one nuance to that that was interesting was that if we look at our conceptual framework, in many ways, it's defining principles that guide our standard setting activities, but aren't necessarily the same in function and purpose as the TCFD's principles, which are principles for effective disclosure for companies. So guidance for companies to aspire to and how they think about reporting information. So what we could think about is aspects of the learning that we had from our mapping, where there were things that the TCFD mentioned and other frameworks had guidance for that we could consider implementing through the different documents that we have, such as our application guidance. So for example, we don't have any principles-based guidance on how information should be presented. And that ties back to an item that Anton shared in the implementation discussion around potentially helping companies by giving them more clarity around how they should present information, not just what the information is. Another items that we could consider is more guidance around the timeliness of updates of reported information. The TCFD has some specific guidance around that, whereas we essentially generally say you should provide this information on the same time frame as you provide your financial information. But if there's a material change in your reported greenhouse gas emissions, we don't have specific guidance around how you would treat that, for example. For the disclosures, again, all the participant frameworks generally were aligned or complementary with the 11 disclosures. Some things for SASB to think about. Really, we don't have in-depth metrics describing or asking companies to disclose their governance strategy or risk management around specific topics. In our standards, we provide general guidance for that in our standards application guidance. And in some cases, for some topics, we have specific qualitative metrics that ask the company to disclose its strategy or discuss its risk management. But as a general principle, we don't include guidance like this, which is, of course, part of the TCFD's framework. Of course, for metrics and targets, that's our wheelhouse, our comfort zone, and we provide that set of industry-specific metrics to facilitate target setting within the TCFD framework. So it's one thing for us to keep in mind is, do we think we have any value that we can add, or would we really, not be adding value? Is it already well established in the market? Considering enhancing our guidance around what companies should be disclosing around governance, strategy, and risk management of material sustainability issues.
What they should be disclosing or what they should be doing?
What they should be disclosing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we hope that the disciplining force of disclosure leads to greater improvements in real activities as well as capital allocation. Question on the metrics and targets. So one thing that could also be helpful is identifying which metrics and targets, we believe would be particularly climate related for a given industry, because it's not always obvious when looking at the groupings. I don't think it's just the ones that are labeled emissions. So
yeah, it's a great point.
Thought about that in terms of facilitating the use of SASB as an implementation tool for good TCFD implementation.
Yeah, it's a great point. One of the documents that we have that is not updated that did a great job at that is the Climate Risk Technical Bulletin. So we have started work on revising and updating that to reflect the codified standards. But again, it's a question of prioritization, and I think that's definitely an important piece in terms of positioning SASB as an effective climate disclosure tool.
Because it would seem like, to the extent we leave it, if it would be burdensome for us to identify which metrics are climate related, then it's going to be burdensome for companies to do that as well, and that limits the usefulness really of SASB as a tool for implementation of TCFD. But if we can do that and then have solved that to a degree for the marketplace, so that they may have come to the same relatively easy conclusion that we would if they had looked at it, but by messaging that there is, this is a great way to start thinking about what are the relevant metrics and topics around climate in your industry, then it's easier for them to turn to us as a way to take that next step with the commitment that they've made. If they're one of these 800, probably it's now 1,000 companies that are.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That's a great point. I think that's something for us to keep in mind in terms of how we prioritize some of these projects. So, and one final one as we jump into the illustrative example metrics. In general, it was good to see a high level of alignment across the participating frameworks. That'll really come to life when the report is released. But there were some significant differences found. In many cases, those differences, made some sense given the frameworks have different purposes or uses, but not in all cases. So there's some areas where we may recommend different ways of measuring things that we can further analyze to assess whether additional alignment would, best serve our stakeholder audiences, given all the things we optimize for in our conceptual framework. So some considerations for SASB, as I just mentioned, some areas of difference make sense, and we just want to be thoughtful about why those differences exist, and others we can assess for potential enhanced alignment as one input for our overall standard setting activities.
The scope of missions is a good example.
Yes.
of that.
Yes.
We, to some extent, compromise to trying to push scope 2 and scope 3 because the prevalence was not there in the industry, but there's certainly the ramifications of the emissions you cause through other parties.
Totally, and I think one of the things that was really interesting about this exercise is really scrutinizing where there were differences, understanding why in some cases the metrics we selected really supported the investment decision-making process better than maybe other metrics would when speaking to a broader audience. And so it really requires a case-by-case sort of in-depth critical analysis to understand whether the metric we have in place is the best use for our stakeholders, or whether there might be opportunities to align to lower cost burden or something like that. So it's not a straightforward formula, for sure.
So related to that, where do you think we house that kind of knowledge? Is there, internally we want to be consistent, we want to track decisions we make around these sorts of trade-offs.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them may be principle-based, and so be something that can be articulated. It could be articulated in different formats through different documents. It could be part of an explanation of a change, could be part of an explanation of what we mean within the standard, why it is what it is. It could be part of a conceptual framework that we have. Thoughts on that?
It's a really good question. So I can say the institutional knowledge is there. It requires a lot of work to pull that together into a narrative. So from when we were doing this work, a lot of it was digging back into all the historical stakeholder feedback we had, understanding, looking at bases for conclusions, arguments we had made around why we felt a certain metric was correct, given applicability, representativeness. And so that information is all there. It's not incredibly easy to pull that all together into something that you can have a clear narrative around. So I think that's something else that we talk about as a potential project for how can we enhance the ways that we can pull this evidence that we have into something that can clearly explain the decisions that have been made that have led to the standards in their current form. But it's incredibly useful for thinking about problems like this.
Did this project result in some of those clear path forward fixes for globalization or not so much?
Potentially. So I think we understand some areas where we're the same and different, but I would say we haven't done the analytical work yet beyond a few cases to see whether this is something that clearly points to a revision or not. So we would want to do that as our next step. And that's actually a very topical thing. So maybe I'll just quickly broadly ask any other questions around this project, the purpose, scope, and findings. Otherwise, we can dive into quickly some of the things we might think about doing with the findings. But just quick, anything around the framing.
David, when you make the comparison, so would the comparison detail be available to us? Okay.
Yes. So the report will be issued soon, and we'll all have it available.
And at the end of the day, are our distinguishing factors still materiality, industry, and metrics?
Those are aspects of what make us different than some of the other frameworks. Some of the others are also a financially material focused framework. Some of them also include industry specificity to some level, like CDP has industry specific questions. So it's kind of a mix.
Would a market feedback requirement be unique for us?
No, so GRI has a feedback mechanism. They have a standards board structure as well. And I think all the organizations, except CDP, have a public feedback mechanism associated with them. But certainly that's part of our governance. So we can't just make editorial changes on our own. We're always subject to our governance. Good point.
From a company perspective, if they said, well, we're already reporting to CDP, what would be added if we brought SASB into the conversation? Is this mapping project something we could use to help answer that kind of question?
Yes. So I think the report will help unpack considerations a company would make when evaluating the different disclosure frameworks available to them and why it might choose certain frameworks given its objectives for to whom it's trying to communicate information for what purpose. It will also help in that for a company that is using CDP or is using SASB and wants to understand the implications of adding in an additional framework, where information that is reporting for one framework may be applicable or to another framework, highlighting some of the differences that exist between the two.
That's kind of where I was going, like from a perspective in research, you need to see companies not reporting on a number of these, but then reporting very well but you have to go hunt 12 different frameworks to see.
Absolutely. So we want to hopefully, one of the hopes is that it would enable more efficient reporting of information across multiple channels to eliminate or reduce the need for that sort of hunt.
Is there any talk about a consolidated, I guess this was a dialogue and an exploration, but some sort of consolidated reporting platform?
So you're describing it, I think really that's an idea, maybe something that could be thought about in the future, but before we could even consider that, we needed to really understand where we're the same and where we're different.
I think that was, I was on the CRD when they were originally talking about this, and I think to your point, Lloyd, this is the impetus to have the information in order to do what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
At least for this particular area.
Yeah.
I wouldn't suggest it for every area, but climate seems so universal. So
definitely. And I think that's why we started there.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at after climate, if you look at other issues,
Yeah.
would it be a difference in social services?
That's a good question. I mean, probably, yeah. I think certainly ourselves in DRI have a lot beyond climate, which would be a key focus area.
Nice.
So maybe just to wrap up real quick, I think for standard setting, one of the key takeaways is really what do we do about these areas where we've looked at our frameworks and there are areas of overlap. Let's start with both. So where there's no areas of overlap, maybe in some instances, there's things that we could do to provide better clarity around why we're different. But where there are areas of overlap, then there's further assessment needed of what is the nature of that overlap. If there are differences and those differences are necessary, given the different audiences, scope, function, purposes of each framework, then it's possible we could provide better clarity to explain the nature of these differences to better support reporting entities in selecting the right tools for them to communicate information most efficiently and effectively. If differences are not necessary, then that's potential for us to explore additional alignment or enhancing alignment. And so that's really the assessment that I'm suggesting we might consider in terms of carrying forward this work. And so what that might look like is a decision tree like this, where we have these binary mappings. We understand whether we're the same or different. If we are different, understand the intentionality around whether those differences make sense. And if the differences do make sense, do we need to clarify why that is? If the differences don't need to be in place, do we think a revision is justified? And so this is a way that we can parse through and filter through all of the learnings from this, which are significant. If you think about 50 metrics, each mapped with 3 different organizations, that's a lot of considerations. So we certainly want to prioritize. But in terms of alignment, this is a really kind of a gold mine of information that we now have available to us. So I think it's worthwhile for the board to keep in mind that this is something that now has been done and is available to us and could be a resource when we think about potential future standard setting work.
So one thought too, in the is a revision justified category.
Mm-hmm.
That could be answered from a number of different perspectives. But you could also think of it like, is a revision likely to be worthwhile? And I think of that a little bit in terms of that it's not that we are trying to align with something etched in stone, but we're potentially trying to ride a little closer, to use another sports analogy, to somebody else in the peloton, but realizing that we happen to be riding relatively close, so we could end up, trying to stay with them, but realizing that their path may also change at some point as well. So it's a bit of a moving target.
And that's a great point. This is a snapshot that we've taken, right? And we're all independent organizations. each with our own stakeholders. None of our frameworks are static, so you're 100% correct. But it gives us some signals about particular areas where we could consider whether there might be a high ROI in terms of adoption and, you know, really fulfilling the conceptual framework if we seek additional alignment. So those are the areas that I would suggest we really try to focus on.
I thought this was a great little framework.
I'm an engineer. I love stuff.
Yeah.
If it's not in the flowchart, it doesn't exist.
Now,
Right?
let me just ask, is there a thought that just inherently you want to take some of the work that has been done and try to run it through the system to see which buckets it ends up in, just so it's sort of ready for potential input into prioritization, or is it like, well, it's out there, and if you ask us to do it, we'll do it, but,
That's a good question. I think my personal view is there's some value there that's worth mining, given we've invested a significant amount of work to do the mapping. It seems like there's some value there to carry that forward. But really, you know, the board's view is you know, what I'm looking for. So
We've seen the low-hanging fruit is that right-left bridge
Yeah.
you did,
Yeah.
where they are similar, but we haven't really clarified it, and if we can at least more through verbiage rather than rippling through metric calculations, do it might be worthwhile.
That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, the experience that I've had suggests that there's a lot that we can do there. I think there's even some things on the metric front that we could weave into other projects we're already doing that would be helpful. But as it relates to multiple of the areas that we're seeking prioritization on, I touched on some things with governance documents, some things with thematic issues of measurement, some industry-specific considerations, our application guidance in general alignment. All of those have value, but probably the alignment portion is the one that is the most of use given this project.
So going back to Anton's phrase of order of operations, you know, you can run everything through the Plinko or whatever, you know, yeah, or in thinking about other potential projects, you could turn to this work.
Yes, I think it's a combination of both. So for particular high priority areas where there's a lot of value, we can, as we discussed before, we can think about constructing a specific project. Otherwise, this can be sort of our set of considerations that are baked into all other projects that we're doing that are being driven by some other more urgent pressing factor. So I think we can do a lot to help ourselves with very thoughtful strategic project design. Great, well, that's all I had. I think I went a little bit over, but left some time for discussion, so thank you.
Thanks, David. So we do have about, 15, 20 minutes left. Just as an opportunity to revisit, everybody who spoke to you today is still here and can be held accountable. So we can go back and add additional clarity or erase things that you haven't heard today. Keeping in mind we are going to be talking tomorrow specifically what our rules of procedure and possible opportunities to make some changes there, our conceptual framework, and what we could potentially do there. And then there are going to be 4 prototype projects, which hopefully are again illustrative of what's involved in thinking about approaching something from a materiality perspective in a sector or measurement perspective in a sector or thematic issue, or talking about industry structure. So they are prototypical examples that we'll be thinking about as well. But yeah, we have a bit of time now, so very happy to throw any question you want to raise back to the research team.
Yeah, on the adoption summary that you had, I know we're sort of just getting started on it, but I think as you think through that, I'd like us to think about at some point within that population reporting the size of the company, and that might be 2 ways. That might be revenue size, and you sort of do, below $1 billion, $1.5 billion, 5 to 10, over 10, or something like that. Another thing to think about too is could you also do it by market cap? So I'm trying to understand that are these the big guys or the little guys that are doing all this reporting and how much, or the little ones just mentioning it, or the big ones reporting that. And then, at some point you could cut all that by industry. There'll be a lot of blank checkerboard there because we're just getting started. And I also think, again, we'll have to look it up, but this whole third-party assurance notion, I'd like to understand, is that concentrated in an industry? Is that concentrated among the big companies, et cetera? So I think those are the things we might think about going forward as we continue to do the adoption model.
Great, fantastic. The first couple points would be extremely straightforward for us to address, given how we capture that data. So we can provide that follow-up with that data. The second point around third-party assurance, that's something we're working on now, and I think over the next month or two we'll have some data on that.
All right, so I'll throw this one out. I don't know how to think about this. So we've got the 11 different categories, or whatever the right word is, that we're thinking about with different ways, traits, to talk about the different topics that we might address. But then we've also got 5 buckets, being conceptual, practical, presentation, legal, and technical. Are those 2 different dimensions in your guys' minds as you think about prioritization? You know, there was one slide that you had in there, I think on this number compared to the latest version you're using, but it was around 50. That talked about from implementation barriers to strategic priorities and research projects, and sort of said, you know, overlay like the different 11 categories versus conceptual, practical, presentation, legal, and technical. I mean, I don't think we can do. Normally, I like to think about this like a portfolio. Allocate, you know, some research time into all of those different buckets, but 11 is too many. Nor do I think that would necessarily make sense. 5 buckets you can do, you know, you can have some things that are going on that are conceptually oriented, practical oriented, presentation, legal, and technical. I'm just trying to reconcile those 2 different dimensions. Is there a way to think about it that I should be?
Yeah, good question, Mark. Thank you. I'll share a couple comments, and then Anton or David, please follow up. 2 different dimensions, the former conceptual, practical, and so on, the technical. That dimension is a pathway to corporate adoption, where companies are and where they could potentially get hung up. When we look at the 11 different categories or traits, those are potential projects, traits of potential standard setting projects. So I think that the first dimension, the pathway to adoption, gives us insight into which of those 11 different traits are highest priority from the perspective of driving corporate adoption. It might be a different conversation maximizing quality of the standard, certainly correlated, but it might be a different conversation, and that's why we wanted to frame this as one input for the board to keep in mind where companies are or might get hung up as they move to adoption, and then how that should relate, if at all, to the board coming to staff with priorities around what projects we should focus. And I think that could be a healthy debate to have.
But is the right way to interpret this slide, 51 here, that by focusing on some of these projects with these types of traits, you know, scope, application guidance, governance documents, materiality, that would be a way to address the issues for those companies that are early on in thinking about using standards or standards.
Let me follow up with one more comment. That's a reasonable way to interpret what we're saying here. There's another dimension that we should address as well, which is the traits 1 through 11 are designed to be within the realm of standard setting, so the standards themselves. There are issues outside of standard setting that are related to conceptual, practical presentation, and that might be things like general education. It might be case studies. It might be webinars. It might be, in investor forums and so forth. And so that's why it's a complicated answer, is that standard setting can help advance companies along that pathway, but it one, will be limited because some of the obstacles are outside of standard setting or in this more adoption supporting area. And so we don't know and can't know with clairvoyance to what extent doing standard setting, picking up standard setting projects over on that left-hand side of the pathway will accelerate corporate adoption. That's why I think staff would generally approach this from the perspective of quality of the standards and fulfillment of the conceptual framework. With that said, this is important for us all to think about at the same time, because that pathway does give us insight into potential standard setting projects and priorities.
And just quickly on that, things like the SAG survey could provide additional insight into exactly whether standard setting questions could facilitate, and not just the SAG survey, but the things like the SAG survey, and, because we could also follow up there, do additional things. But some of what we saw in the survey, the detailed survey results, were whether or not, where some of those members were in thinking about or trying to, to the extent that we can find out, whether this is a normal challenge along the way that they're going to have to get through versus that it's something that we can address through standard setting that stops that from being an issue. But, so we can learn, because there are other forms of input that can help us to answer this question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the other way we could potentially think about this is, as Brian said, these are something where companies are hang up. So let's say there's potentially we could address, let's say, practical and presentation issues, and that if we were kind of like forget completely about technical, it would just move the skew to the right and kind of still kind of end up hanging up on the way to adoption, but just move further, which then prompt us to refocus our attention. But what I also think could happen is, at least what I think in terms of when we're going to be actually scoping out projects, it's probably very likely that they will touch on more than one category. So let's say we're going to be researching a topic within the scope of one industry. Naturally, it would follow up, even if potentially within the scope of a project right away or as a follow-up project, we would have to address a measurement of that topic right away, which you can see it relates to the technical hang-up category. So those could be addressed. So I think that's a way to.
No, I agree. Nothing's perfect. And so my thought process has been to sort of make sure that we're at least touching something in every one of these categories.
Yeah.
These conceptual, practical, presentation, legal, technical. Not to sort of say, I'm going to look at practical to the exclusion of technical. In fact, just the opposite. Think about it like a portfolio so that we're not doing that.
Yeah.
But in terms of the 11, which I get are how we do our own standard setting, I sort of get that. But we could set the best, highest quality standard in the world if you're really good about it. If nobody's adopted it, it's not really making a difference. So we're trying to think, am I thinking about, is it a reasonable way to think about it? Is to have sort of something in every one of these buckets and potentially weighted differently based on the histogram like you did here.
These are to some extent, these are arbitrary categories.
Correct, but you've got to think about them.
Yeah.
You've got to. I just need to bucket them in my head one way or another. So I was just trying to think of the pros and cons of.
Yeah, as to whether we need more clarity for legal or not.
Maybe not.
I like the perspective of thinking about it as a portfolio, but I would apply the portfolio lens to this. And then as a result, you could also overlay it on those 5 categories. But I think the portfolio management perspective better applies to this on allocation of resources.
A meeting or two ago, we talked about, it's been a long time, we talked about recurring revisions and the timeline for that. Did we land on something? And if so, this conversation should happen probably in the context of what can be done in the revision, the natural revision process versus what needs to be done at one time, right? So,
I think I covered that. So what we decided, if you're referring to the 3-year cycle versus project-based standard setting,
right,
what we decided was that we had always said we would address things that on a timely basis that needed to be done, and that we would reopen everything every 3 years, and we have moved off of the idea that it would ever make sense on a 3-year cycle to open everything up. And so that we are going to be addressing issues, I mean, we're going to be maintaining the standards exclusively through project-based work, which could be narrow or large in scope, depending on the nature of what the board wants to prioritize.
okay, so even if we decide we're gonna do these 2 projects, they wouldn't,
No, it would depend on the nature of the project.
Right.
So whatever comes out of this prioritization discussion today and tomorrow, that will provide some guidance to the research team to go work on some specific projects, which they would bring back, and eventually those would get onto our agenda for standard setting activity. They would have as part of that a scope of intended work, and it might be that the team would say, these things we can bring back to you within a month or within 3 months, and we plan to put something back to you for a vote sooner rather than later. Other projects would take longer than that in the life cycle of the work. And anything that was a substantive change to any of the standards would require, typically, we would want to do 90 days of exposure on that before listening to any comments that we got and then deciding what to do at that point. So, but it's just like it wouldn't be locked to a 3-year cycle. It would depend on capacity and our due process.
Jeff, I think there's another distinction that we should probably take into consideration, and that's whether if it ripples up into metrics, is this an additive change? In other words, here's the way to be relevant in Asia, versus is this a comprehensive change where everybody has to change what they're doing?
Yeah.
And it would seem that the bar for an additive change that doesn't force rework is much lower than what should be a very high bar for, are we going to change this specifically for everybody?
Yeah, it's a great point. When I think about our criteria for agenda setting, the issues around scope, how prevalent is it, how pervasive, that tells us something about how big of an issue it potentially is, but it also, would influence maybe how costly it would be to change. And, it may not be that costly if no one's actually reporting in that area. Yeah, this is the thing that leads to it, but.
So we go to our industries that are at least penetrated and make the changes.
But the point is well taken that those sorts of thoughts are around both importance and we always need to be mindful of the cost of what we're asking in order to get a particular improvement.
You guys are giving us a lot to think about.
I guess I just want to reflect out loud, if that's okay. I think, some of the feedback we heard from the Standards Advisory Group and the materiality map assessment, I think, specifically the SASB feedback on a topic level about missing topics, to me, those seem like important areas that we can continue to fine tune metrics over time and align them and make them more global. But our real bread and butter is that materiality topic level, and I think we ought to make sure that we're putting a big portion of our effort there to make sure we're getting those structural issues right and capturing the emergent ones too. I mean, we did the last cycle was a 6-year cycle for us, and we didn't have the latitude or the breadth to kind of get current if things are happening faster than this year. So
Is that fair though? There's a 6-year cycle. Well, the last year and a half or 2 years. Felt like we reached years. Well, we packed 6 years in, but it felt like we reached pretty much revisited everything. Now, I wasn't there for the legacy stuff in the first couple of years, but.
Well, but also there was 2 years of work or so leading up to even before we formed the standards company.
yeah.
Yeah, it just seems to me like, in the end, you're gonna have a list of projects you could do. And we're going to have to try to offer some constructive advice on which ones to do a lower or to do a more. It sounds like you guys could supply even a notional list of, here are the 18 things that seems plausible that could do. I think we may want to just try and devise a point system and say, look, there's a lot of different industries, or do we think this makes the standard more global? Or, and then, I don't know if we can agree on it or not, but that would at least give us a way to preliminary way to rank these projects.
So I think one of the challenges around it as well is that it's one thing to, and the staff tomorrow is going to give us a preliminary view on ways that we might think about prioritizing among projects with these traits. It's also a big ask. I think that's a reasonably big ask to ask of the project, as the research team, but to ask for project proposals that would have enough context to be able to think through how much should it be weighted. It requires decisions around scope and in addition to importance, and that's kind of challenging. So I think of it a little bit less as being, in the end, you'll have a list of projects to work on, as opposed to we're going to be directing some of the research team's efforts towards some specific work right now that will likely result in standard setting projects that will be done in the short term, and that ongoing they will continue to assess their capacity and will continue to talk about issues, and we'll continue to put things into the pipeline where there's capacity and enough work that we can actually make a reasonable judgment about the benefit of that project and the opportunity cost of doing things that way.
Yeah. No, and I think that's good news that we're not trying to develop a comprehensive 2, 3, or 5-year work plan with everything that's expected to take place over a 5-year horizon. What we do want to do in the very near term is launch our agenda and research program and be clear with the public and move forward to start executing projects that we know need to be done or believe are very, very high priority. But then that agenda will be dynamic, and we will continuously or regularly come forward with additional projects beyond that. And so the agenda may start minimal, and that's perfectly fine. That's actually what I would expect, because we need to establish priorities, and then staff will do more work based on those priorities and then come forward with more projects. And so it's an asset that this will be a dynamic agenda and research program, and we don't have to define a 5-year work plan, while we should still have a clear vision of what the priorities are for that longer term work plan.
And I think this is a good time to just comment on what we can now expect in the cadence of our regular board meetings, that we will be hearing updates on projects that are ongoing, and that we will also have regular agenda setting decisions that will be made, both in terms of what we're specifically hearing on new potential projects based on what we've talked about and priorities that we've indicated, as well as if we've decided that we no longer think that something is a priority or is moving forward in a way that makes sense for the team to be working on it, that could be de-escalated as well. Based on feedback that we got from public comments that it's not worth the change. So that'll be ongoing, and we will routinely, probably on an annual basis, revisit the agendas that we have and just make sure that there is progress or whether or not we need to make any reallocations of time. So this is going to be an ongoing part of the regular cadence of our standard setting meetings in a way that, which is why I think it was the third phase of the work that we've done, because that's just not that's not the way we have done things in the past, because we were at a different stage of developing standards previously.
It seems like there's no one decision rule that's going to get us there. We're just going to look at a number of different things at a time.
Okay, well, I think with that we will we'll close for today, and I'll thank our listeners who were dialed in, and I'll mention that we will be starting tomorrow morning at 10:30 with the public portion of our meeting, and we'll be going until 1:30 Eastern Time tomorrow. So thank everybody for joining us today, and with that we'll close this session.